Chapter 1: Prelude to the Battle. In the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, initiating a broad campaign to dismantle terrorist networks across Afghanistan. Among the first major efforts to disrupt al-Qaeda and Taliban operations was Operation Anaconda, conceived as a direct assault on entrenched enemy positions in the rugged terrain of eastern Afghanistan. But before troops could set foot in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, a complex series of events unfolded, setting the stage for one of the most intense battles of the early war. The rise of the Taliban in the 1990s created a sanctuary for terrorist groups like al-Qaeda, whose operations culminated in the attacks on American soil. By early 2002, U.S. intelligence had pinpointed concentrations of Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters regrouping in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, a strategic area known for its difficult geography and long-standing use as a militant haven. The region's high altitude, steep ridges, and limited access made it an ideal location for defensive insurgent activity. As Washington sought to prevent these forces from re-establishing themselves, military planners focused on developing a coordinated assault that would close off escape routes and trap enemy fighters. However, accurate intelligence was hard to come by. Enemy numbers, terrain familiarity, and the ever-evolving movement of insurgent units posed ongoing challenges. Despite these obstacles, satellite imagery and field reports painted a picture of a determined enemy preparing for a last stand. Meanwhile, strategic goals went beyond simply killing or capturing insurgents. The operation aimed to test the ability of joint U.S. and coalition forces to execute complex maneuvers under fire. It also served as a proving ground for the evolving relationship between conventional military units and special operations teams. The goal was clear: demonstrate American resolve, disrupt terrorist infrastructure, and send a signal that Afghanistan would no longer be a safe haven for extremist factions. The groundwork laid during this phase would dictate the tempo and outcome of the battle to come. Though largely overshadowed by the combat that followed, the prelude to Operation Anaconda was vital in shaping the coalition's understanding of the enemy, clarifying the importance of intelligence fusion, and highlighting the necessity of cohesive command structures. As the plans solidified, the troops prepared to descend into one of the most grueling battles of the early 21st century. The rise of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. The origins of the Taliban and al-Qaeda trace back to the turbulence of the late 20th century, particularly during and after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. This conflict created fertile ground for the emergence of militant groups, as foreign fighters and local insurgents joined forces to expel Soviet troops. Funded in part by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, this loose alliance of Mujahideen fighters laid the foundation for both the Taliban movement and the future rise of al-Qaeda. The Taliban emerged in the early 1990s out of the chaos that followed the Soviet withdrawal and the subsequent civil war among Afghan factions. Comprised mainly of Pashtun students from Islamic religious schools, hence the name Taliban meaning students in Pashto, the group promised to restore order through strict enforcement of Sharia law. By 1996, the Taliban had seized control of Kabul and declared the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Their rule was marked by harsh social policies, especially against women, and an extreme interpretation of Islamic law that drew global condemnation. While the Taliban focused on consolidating power within Afghanistan, al-Qaeda developed as a transnational jihadist organization under the leadership of Osama bin Laden. After being expelled from Sudan in 1996, bin Laden returned to Afghanistan, where he found a willing host in the Taliban regime. Al-Qaeda established training camps and command centers, using Afghanistan as a secure base from which to plan and execute global terrorist operations. The group's ideology aimed not just at regional influence but at waging a worldwide campaign against perceived enemies of Islam, particularly the United States. The alliance between the Taliban and al-Qaeda was both strategic and ideological. The Taliban benefited from al-Qaeda's financial resources and combat training expertise, while al-Qaeda operated freely under Taliban protection. This partnership culminated in the attacks of September 11, 2001, which led the US and its allies to demand the extradition of bin Laden. The Taliban's refusal to comply triggered the US-led invasion of Afghanistan. By the time Operation Anaconda was launched in 2002, both the Taliban and al-Qaeda had retreated into mountainous regions like the Shah-i-Kot Valley, attempting to regroup and resist coalition forces. Their rise was not only a product of local conflict, but a result of global geopolitical shifts, proxy wars, and the unintended consequences of foreign intervention, factors that would continue to shape the war in Afghanistan for decades. U.S. strategic goals post 9/11. In the wake of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the United States rapidly shifted its global defense posture and adopted a new set of strategic goals centered on counterterrorism, homeland security, and global stability. These attacks, which killed nearly 3,000 people on American soil, marked a turning point in U.S. foreign policy and military planning. The immediate objective was clear: dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that had provided the group with sanctuary in Afghanistan. However, the broader strategy went far beyond retaliation. One of the core goals was to prevent any future terrorist attacks against the United States or its allies. This involved not only eliminating terrorist leaders and destroying operational networks, but also disrupting the ideological and financial lifelines that sustained extremist organizations. Afghanistan, as a base of operations for al-Qaeda, became the first theater in a wider global war on terror. Military planners recognized that defeating terrorism would require a long-term commitment and a combination of military, diplomatic, and intelligence tools. The Bush administration articulated these aims through a doctrine of preemptive action, where perceived threats would be neutralized before they could materialize. This shift in strategy was encapsulated in the 2002 National Security Strategy, which emphasized the need to confront emerging threats in unstable regions. Afghanistan was considered a critical test case for this approach, and the success or failure of early operations like Anaconda would have lasting implications. Strategically, the U.S. also sought to stabilize Afghanistan and prevent it from once again becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. This involved supporting a new Afghan government, promoting democratic institutions, and initiating reconstruction efforts. However, the military remained focused on rooting out the Taliban and al-Qaeda elements that had regrouped in remote areas. Operation Anaconda was conceived as a direct response to intelligence indicating that these forces were reorganizing in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, making it essential to strike before they could launch new offensives or disperse. Coalition building was another central component of the U.S. strategy. By involving NATO allies and regional partners, the U.S. hoped to share the operational burden and lend legitimacy to its actions. These alliances would prove vital in coordinating complex operations in rugged and unfamiliar terrain, where local knowledge and joint planning were critical. Ultimately, the U.S. strategic goals post-9/11 were aimed at transforming a reactive military posture into a proactive campaign designed to prevent future catastrophes. Operation Anaconda became one of the earliest efforts to translate these objectives into action on the battlefield. Intelligence gathering and early warnings. Effective intelligence gathering was at the heart of Operation Anaconda's planning, serving as the foundation upon which the entire mission was built. In the months following the initial invasion of Afghanistan in late 2001, U.S. and coalition forces relied heavily on both technological surveillance and human intelligence to track the movements of Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters. The intelligence community faced the difficult task of locating elusive targets in mountainous terrain, where fighters could easily blend in with the environment or disappear into sympathetic local populations. Early indicators suggested that a significant number of enemy combatants had retreated to the Shah-i-Kot Valley in Paksha province, a rugged region long used by insurgents due to its defensible geography and complex network of cave systems. Reports from Afghan informants and intercepted communications indicated that al-Qaeda leaders were using the valley as a staging ground for regrouping and possibly launching future attacks. Drones and satellite imagery supported these claims by identifying suspicious concentrations of armed fighters and fortified positions. Despite these insights, intelligence on the actual number and disposition of enemy forces remained incomplete and sometimes misleading. Initial estimates significantly undercounted the number of combatants in the area, leading to assumptions that coalition forces would face only light resistance. In reality, the enemy had anticipated an offensive and prepared layered defenses, including mortar positions, machine gun nests, and escape routes through the surrounding hills. Special operations teams played a crucial role in verifying and refining intelligence. Units such as the CIA's Special Activities Division and U.S. Army Special Forces conducted reconnaissance missions and liaised with local Afghan militias to build a clearer picture of the operational landscape. These early efforts uncovered critical details about terrain features, potential ambush points, and the presence of hardened foreign fighters aligned with al-Qaeda. Still, gaps in intelligence persisted. The lack of real-time updates, limitations in communication, and the mountainous terrain itself hindered the flow of accurate information. As a result, some U.S. units entered the battle with an incomplete understanding of the threat they would face. This miscalculation would shape the course of the battle, turning what was expected to be a swift engagement into a protracted and intense firefight. Nevertheless, the intelligence gathered prior to the launch of Operation Anaconda provided a crucial framework. It identified the Shah-i-Kot Valley as a strategic focal point and highlighted the need for swift, decisive action. While not flawless, the early warnings set the stage for one of the most complex operations in the early years of the war in Afghanistan. Chapter 2: Planning Operation Anaconda. The planning phase for Operation Anaconda was marked by a series of challenges that tested the coordination, adaptability, and foresight of U.S. military leadership. After months of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, the decision to launch a large-scale offensive in the Shah-i-Kot Valley was made, but the complexities of the operation were not immediately apparent. The valley, located in the mountainous heart of Afghanistan's Paksha province, was known for its rugged terrain, which would present significant logistical and tactical hurdles. The primary objective was to destroy Taliban and al-Qaeda forces that had regrouped in the area, but the operation also aimed to test the ability of joint and coalition forces to execute complex, high-intensity missions in difficult conditions. U.S. Central Command and the coalition partners carefully orchestrated a multifaceted approach, involving a mix of conventional forces, special operations, and air support. The operation's ultimate goal was not just to engage the enemy, but to clear and secure an area that had become a stronghold for insurgents. The first step in the planning process was determining the right force composition. A joint task force was created, bringing together Army and Marine Corps units, as well as special operations forces from the U.S. and other NATO allies. Special attention was given to the integration of air power, with fighter jets, bombers, and drones set to provide crucial support to ground troops. The operation would rely heavily on close air support and precision bombing to neutralize enemy strongholds and clear enemy positions before ground forces advanced. One of the unique aspects of Operation Anaconda was the involvement of local Afghan forces, who provided critical intelligence and assistance. However, working with Afghan militias also presented challenges, as their loyalty and military effectiveness were uncertain. In addition, the mountainous terrain required careful planning for insertion and extraction of troops, as well as the need for robust supply lines to sustain forces operating deep in enemy territory. Despite the extensive planning, the operation faced logistical difficulties from the outset. The valley's remote location and the enemy's ability to blend into the environment created an unpredictable battlefield. Communications challenges as well as incomplete intelligence about the strength of enemy forces led to some early miscalculations. However, the thorough planning process, the use of special operations teams, and the integration of air and ground forces ultimately laid the groundwork for the operation's execution. In many ways, the planning of Operation Anaconda was a learning process that would inform future operations in Afghanistan. It underscored the necessity of adaptability, the value of coalition partnerships, and the critical role of intelligence in shaping military strategy. Coalition coordination and command structure. The success of Operation Anaconda hinged not only on military tactics and intelligence, but also on the ability of coalition forces to work together effectively under a unified command structure. The operation was a joint effort involving U.S. forces, NATO allies, and local Afghan militias, all of whom had distinct operational priorities and military cultures. Creating a cohesive command structure was a complex and delicate task, given the diverse nature of the forces involved, and the challenging environment in which they would operate. At the core of the operation was U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, which was responsible for overseeing the broader strategy in Afghanistan. Under CENTCOM, a joint task force was formed, consisting of Army, Marine Corps, and Air Force units, along with special operations forces from the U.S. and NATO. This integrated approach was essential for the success of the operation, as it allowed for the coordinated use of air, ground, and special operations forces. One of the challenges of coalition coordination was the integration of NATO forces, which included troops from countries like Canada, the UK, and other allied nations. These forces operated under a combined arms strategy, meaning they had to work closely with U.S. forces while maintaining their own national command structures. This often required clear communication and an understanding of the limitations and strengths of each partner force. Despite the common goal, differing operational procedures, language barriers, and cultural differences posed initial obstacles. However, the multinational nature of the mission was also one of its strengths, bringing diverse expertise and resources to the battlefield. The command structure was designed to be flexible, allowing for the rapid adjustment of plans as the operation progressed. Special operations forces, including U.S. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Afghan commandos, played a pivotal role in providing critical intelligence and executing precise raids. Their knowledge of local terrain and the ability to move stealthily were key to setting the stage for larger operations by conventional forces. On the ground, the integration of air power was crucial. Close air support, provided by fighter jets and bombers, was synchronized with ground assaults, ensuring that enemy positions were neutralized before coalition forces advanced. This required a high level of coordination between air controllers, ground commanders, and intelligence officers to ensure that strikes were accurate and timely. Despite initial coordination challenges, the collaboration between U.S. forces, NATO allies, and Afghan partners became a defining feature of the operation, demonstrating the value of interoperability in modern warfare. The experience gained in Operation Anaconda would go on to shape future coalition operations, underscoring the importance of unity in command and the need for effective coordination in complex military environments. Intelligence assessments and target zones. The effectiveness of Operation Anaconda largely depended on the quality of intelligence assessments and the identification of key target zones within the Shah-i-Kot Valley. Intelligence gathering was a continuous process, providing real-time updates and refining earlier reports to ensure that coalition forces would strike the most critical enemy positions. However, the terrain's complexity and the adaptability of the Taliban and al-Qaeda forces made intelligence assessment a particularly challenging aspect of the operation. The initial intelligence indicated that the Shah-i-Kot Valley was being used by Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters as a defensive stronghold, with the enemy taking advantage of the area's rugged geography to establish well-fortified positions. Satellite imagery, drone surveillance, and human intelligence from Afghan informants painted a picture of large concentrations of enemy fighters hiding within caves and underground bunkers, a feature of the valley that made traditional surveillance and targeting methods difficult. These early assessments led to the identification of several key target zones, where concentrated forces were believed to be hiding, and where immediate airstrikes could weaken enemy defenses. However, as the operation unfolded, it became clear that intelligence was often incomplete or outdated. The number of enemy combatants in the valley was underestimated, and the insurgents had made significant adjustments to their positions based on previous airstrikes. In some cases, intelligence suggested that certain targets were isolated or weak, only for coalition forces to discover heavily defended areas once they had moved in. These miscalculations led to initial delays and forced commanders to quickly adapt their tactics, calling in more air support and adjusting their routes through the valley. One of the key intelligence breakthroughs came from special forces teams on the ground, who provided invaluable reconnaissance. They were able to verify the exact locations of enemy positions, identify escape routes, and refine target zones in real time. This intelligence directly influenced the battle's progression, allowing for more precise airstrikes and artillery support, which helped disrupt the enemy's defensive positions and limit their ability to regroup. In addition to pinpointing enemy concentrations, intelligence assessments also focused on the geography of the region. The mountainous terrain, which provided cover for the enemy, also limited the movement of coalition forces. Understanding the topography allowed for better planning of troop insertions and the identification of natural choke points, which could be used to trap and encircle the enemy. Despite initial setbacks, intelligence assessments throughout Operation Anaconda proved vital in shaping the tactical decisions that ultimately led to the success of the operation. The lessons learned about the importance of accurate, timely intelligence would be applied in future military campaigns, underscoring the need for constant refinement of both human and technical intelligence in complex environments. Initial troop deployment and logistics. The success of Operation Anaconda depended not only on strategic planning and intelligence, but also on the efficient deployment of troops and the management of logistics. The operation called for a rapid and coordinated movement of both U.S. and coalition forces into the rugged, mountainous Shah-i-Kot Valley, a region with limited access and minimal infrastructure. The logistical challenges of inserting troops into such a remote and hostile environment were significant, and careful planning was required to ensure that forces could be sustained throughout the operation. The initial troop deployment began with a combination of air and ground forces. Special operations units, including Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Afghan commandos, were inserted by helicopters into key positions in the valley to conduct reconnaissance and establish secure footholds. These small, highly trained units were tasked with gathering critical intelligence, identifying enemy positions, and providing initial contact with the local Afghan militias. Their success in these early stages of the operation was crucial for setting the stage for larger ground forces. The bulk of conventional troops, including Army and Marine Corps units, were transported into the valley via large-scale airlift operations. The logistical complexity of moving thousands of soldiers, vehicles, and equipment into a remote and hostile area required precise coordination. Heavy transport helicopters and C-130 cargo planes played a pivotal role, delivering supplies, ammunition, and equipment to forward operating bases while avoiding enemy air defenses. The ability to maintain a constant flow of supplies, including food, fuel, and medical support, was essential for the troops operating in such an isolated environment. Another significant logistical challenge was the provision of close air support. The operation relied heavily on fighter jets, bombers, and drones to provide air superiority, conduct precision strikes, and ensure that ground forces were protected from enemy counterattacks. Coordination between air support and ground forces was crucial, as troops on the ground had to communicate in real time to call in airstrikes while avoiding collateral damage. The difficulty of maneuvering in the steep, mountainous terrain also impacted troop deployment. Convoys were limited in their ability to travel long distances, forcing troops to navigate narrow, winding paths on foot. This constrained movement slowed the pace of the operation, as forces had to carefully navigate enemy-held areas while maintaining security and cohesion. Despite these challenges, the initial deployment of forces was successful in establishing a foothold in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. The logistical and deployment hurdles faced at the outset of the operation highlighted the importance of planning and coordination in large-scale military operations, particularly when operating in challenging environments. The ability to adapt quickly to unforeseen circumstances would prove essential as the battle intensified. Chapter 3: The insertion begins. The insertion phase of Operation Anaconda marked the beginning of a high-stakes mission to neutralize Taliban and al-Qaeda forces entrenched in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. After months of planning and preparation, coalition forces began their deployment into the valley, facing immediate challenges in both the terrain and the enemy's defensive capabilities. The goal of the insertion was not only to secure key positions, but also to establish a foothold in enemy territory from which larger forces could later advance. The operation began with a series of helicopter insertions, with special operations teams and Afghan militia forces being dropped into critical locations to conduct reconnaissance and establish a presence. These small, agile units, including U.S. Army Rangers and Navy SEALs, were tasked with locating enemy positions, marking targets for airstrikes, and laying the groundwork for the main assault. The terrain was treacherous, characterized by steep ridges and dense forests that hindered both visibility and mobility. Despite these challenges, the special operations teams moved swiftly and silently, gathering crucial intelligence about enemy movements and fortifications. The initial phase of the insertion was met with immediate resistance. Taliban and al-Qaeda forces, well aware of the impending assault, had fortified key positions within caves, bunkers, and narrow ravines. As the Special Operations Forces landed, they quickly encountered enemy fire, engaging in firefights that were intense but relatively isolated. The task force's ability to adapt to the enemy's tactics and the terrain became crucial in preventing these small engagements from escalating into larger battles. Meanwhile, conventional ground forces, including U.S. Army units, began their own insertion into the valley. These troops, transported by helicopters and ground convoys, had to deal with both the logistical challenges of moving through the rough landscape and the constant threat of ambushes. Air support, which had been a cornerstone of the planning process, was instrumental in providing cover for these movements, targeting enemy positions before the main assault forces advanced. As the insertion unfolded, the valley's isolation began to present unforeseen challenges. Communications between units were sometimes delayed or interrupted, and air support had to be carefully coordinated to avoid friendly fire incidents. Yet, despite these obstacles, the insertion was deemed successful, with the majority of forces reaching their designated positions. The beginning of the insertion phase marked the first tangible step in the execution of Operation Anaconda. While the mission was still in its early stages, it was clear that the coalition forces had established a foothold in one of the most difficult and heavily defended regions of Afghanistan. The success of the insertion set the stage for the larger battles that would follow, determining the tempo and direction of the operation. Helicopter landings in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. The helicopter landings in the Shah-i-Kot Valley were a critical component of the initial phase of Operation Anaconda. The valley's rugged terrain and limited road access made helicopters the most effective means of inserting troops, supplies, and equipment into the heart of enemy territory. However, these landings were fraught with challenges, as the valley was not only difficult to navigate but also heavily contested by Taliban and al-Qaeda forces who were entrenched in the region. Helicopter landings in the Shah-i-Kot Valley were conducted under the cover of darkness and in a highly coordinated manner to reduce the risk of enemy detection and counterattacks. U.S. Army Chinooks, Black Hawks, and other transport helicopters carried infantry, special operations forces, and Afghan militias into the valley, targeting specific landing zones that had been identified during intelligence gathering and reconnaissance missions. These zones, however, were far from secure and posed immediate risks to the helicopters and their occupants. As helicopters touched down, troops quickly disembarked and established perimeters to secure the landing zones. The risk of enemy ambushes and mortar fire was high, as insurgents had a good understanding of the area's topography and had likely prepped for the arrival of coalition forces. Despite the danger, the landings were executed with precision, and the troops quickly fanned out to secure key areas while providing cover for subsequent landings. One of the significant risks during these helicopter landings was the mountainous terrain itself. The valley's steep slopes and narrow passes made it difficult for helicopters to land in safe, open spaces. The landing zones had to be carefully selected to ensure they were large enough to accommodate multiple helicopters, while still providing some degree of protection from enemy fire. Additionally, the valley's altitude and unpredictable weather conditions added another layer of complexity to the landings. High winds and low visibility, often exacerbated by dust storms, made flying conditions hazardous for the pilots and their crews. Despite these challenges, the helicopter landings were largely successful, marking a key moment in the operation's early stages. The landings provided coalition forces with a foothold in enemy territory, allowing them to begin securing key areas, setting up forward operating bases, and establishing supply lines for the troops that would follow. They also provided crucial intelligence on enemy positioning, which would be used to guide subsequent airstrikes and ground assaults. Ultimately, the success of the helicopter landings demonstrated the adaptability and precision of U.S. and coalition forces in executing complex, high-risk maneuvers in hostile environments. These landings were pivotal in setting the stage for the larger, more intense combat operations that would unfold in the coming days. Unexpected resistance and first engagements. As the initial wave of troops began to secure their positions in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, the coalition forces quickly encountered unexpected resistance from Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters, marking the beginning of intense combat. The resistance was far greater than initial intelligence reports had predicted, throwing the operation's timeline and expectations into uncertainty. Despite careful planning, the enemy was not only better entrenched than anticipated, but also more prepared for the assault. The first engagements occurred shortly after the helicopter landings, as troops moved to establish perimeters around key landing zones. Coalition forces, including Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Afghan militias, encountered heavy small arms fire, mortars, and machine gun positions that had been strategically placed along the valley's ridgelines. What had been expected to be a relatively quick insertion turned into an immediate firefight, as insurgents from both the Taliban and al-Qaeda launched coordinated attacks on the advancing troops. What made the resistance unexpected was the strength and positioning of the enemy forces. They had fortified caves and bunkers along the terrain's natural choke points, using the valley's rugged geography to their advantage. Insurgents had strategically positioned themselves along narrow ravines and cliff edges, forcing coalition forces to advance slowly and carefully through the dangerous landscape. Additionally, the fighters were well prepared with an extensive knowledge of the terrain, making them difficult to dislodge with conventional methods. As the first engagements unfolded, the coalition forces faced challenges in adapting to the enemy's tactics. Mortar fire was frequently aimed at landing zones and troop concentrations, complicating the movement of reinforcements and supplies. The dense fog and dust storms that occasionally rolled through the valley added to the confusion, reducing visibility and hindering air support. Special operations teams worked tirelessly to direct airstrikes on enemy positions, but the heavily fortified caves and bunkers required multiple bombing runs to neutralize. Despite the unexpected resistance, the coalition forces began to gain ground, although at a slower pace than anticipated. The first engagements were marked by a combination of small skirmishes, ambushes, and firefights, with both sides suffering casualties. The resilience of the Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters in holding their positions demonstrated the difficult nature of the fight ahead. These early encounters in the Shah-i-Kot Valley highlighted the importance of adaptability and quick decision-making. The unexpected resistance forced the coalition forces to adjust their strategies, using a combination of airstrikes, artillery, and infantry assaults to push forward. The early engagements in the valley marked only the beginning of a protracted battle that would test the resolve and effectiveness of the coalition forces in the days to come. Tactical reassessment in the field. As Operation Anaconda progressed, the unexpected strength and tenacity of the Taliban and al-Qaeda forces in the Shah-i-Kot Valley led to a critical need for tactical reassessment in the field. The initial plans, based on the assumption of lighter resistance, were quickly found to be inadequate, as coalition forces encountered well-prepared insurgents entrenched in the valley's rugged terrain. These unforeseen challenges forced commanders on the ground to make swift adjustments to strategies and tactics, often under pressure and with limited resources. One of the first issues that prompted a reassessment was the unexpected intensity of enemy fire. Taliban and al-Qaeda forces had established strong defensive positions in caves, bunkers, and on high ridgelines, making it difficult for coalition forces to make significant headway. The narrow mountain passes and steep cliffs added complexity to ground assaults, with infantry units unable to move freely without being exposed to enemy fire from multiple angles. The initial assumption that airstrikes would be enough to neutralize these positions proved to be insufficient, as many of the caves were deep and fortified, requiring more precise and sustained efforts. To adapt to these realities, commanders in the field began to focus on more gradual, methodical progress rather than the rapid assault initially envisioned. Special operations forces, having already established footholds in key areas, became critical in providing intelligence, guiding air support, and directing artillery strikes on enemy positions. These units also played a vital role in identifying weak points in the enemy's defenses, which allowed larger conventional forces to exploit openings and secure key ground. Another key reassessment involved the coordination between ground troops and air support. Initially, airstrikes were called in primarily to soften enemy positions before infantry moved in. However, due to the unexpected resistance, air support had to be used more dynamically, with real-time adjustments being made to strike enemy positions as troops advanced. This required constant communication and an ability to adapt quickly to the evolving battlefield. The reassessment also led to a shift in the pacing of the operation. Commanders realized that the operation would take longer than anticipated, requiring more supplies and reinforcements to sustain momentum. This shift in expectations also meant that forces had to become more resourceful, relying on their ability to adapt to difficult terrain and unexpected resistance. Ultimately, the tactical reassessment in the field allowed Operation Anaconda to regain momentum, despite the unexpected resistance. The ability to adjust strategies, reinforce effective tactics, and rely on real-time intelligence proved crucial in overcoming the challenges posed by the enemy's fortified positions. The reassessment became a defining feature of the operation, showcasing the importance of flexibility and adaptability in modern warfare. Chapter 4: The battle intensifies. As the operation continued, the battle in the Shah-i-Kot Valley intensified, marking a shift from initial skirmishes to large-scale sustained combat. The Taliban and al-Qaeda forces, entrenched in the rugged terrain and fortified positions, fought fiercely to defend their stronghold. What had begun as a calculated assault turned into a prolonged and brutal confrontation, pushing coalition forces to the limits of their planning and resources. The terrain, already a challenge during the initial landings, became even more of a hindrance as the battle deepened. The mountainous landscape, with its steep ridges, narrow passes, and caves, provided the enemy with numerous opportunities to ambush advancing troops. The enemy's defensive positions were well established, and they used the terrain to inflict heavy casualties on coalition forces. Coalition troops found themselves engaged in a battle of attrition, slowly advancing under constant fire from above, often without the ability to return fire from the same advantageous positions. This new phase of the battle saw a major shift in tactics, as the coalition forces adapted to the escalating resistance. The focus moved from fast-paced insertion and maneuver to a more methodical approach, as troops worked to clear enemy positions one by one. Infantry units, supported by airstrikes and artillery, were tasked with securing key objectives, but progress remained slow due to the fierce opposition. The insurgents had an intimate knowledge of the terrain, allowing them to execute ambushes with great efficiency, while the coalition forces had to rely on their ability to adapt, coordinate air support, and employ specialized units for reconnaissance and sabotage. The battle also saw increased coordination between air, ground, and special operations forces. Close air support became even more critical, as fighter jets and attack helicopters worked to target enemy positions from above, providing cover for ground troops engaged in close-quarters combat. Special forces units were deployed to conduct raids and disrupt the enemy's ability to coordinate their defenses, taking out key leadership figures and weakening the morale of the insurgents. Despite the challenges, the coalition forces gradually gained ground. The insurgents, though well prepared and entrenched, were not invincible. Through a combination of intelligence gathering, tactical adjustments, and sustained pressure, the coalition began to break the enemy's hold on the valley. However, the battle's increasing intensity highlighted the high cost of the operation, both in terms of human lives and resources. The Battle of Shah-i-Kot Valley, in the early days of Operation Anaconda, was a brutal reminder of the difficulties of modern warfare, where terrain, enemy ingenuity, and unexpected resistance can all lead to prolonged conflict. As the battle intensified, both sides knew that the outcome would depend on endurance, coordination, and the ability to adapt in the face of adversity. Ambushes and enemy counterattacks. As the battle in the Shah-i-Kot Valley escalated, Taliban and al-Qaeda forces launched numerous ambushes and counterattacks, employing guerrilla tactics to harass and disrupt the progress of coalition forces. These ambushes, which were often executed with surgical precision, posed significant challenges to the advancing troops. The enemy, familiar with the valley's treacherous terrain, used it to their advantage, setting traps and hiding in fortified positions to strike at vulnerable coalition units. The ambushes typically occurred during troop movements, or while supply convoys were attempting to navigate the narrow, winding paths of the valley. Insurgents used the natural cover of caves, cliffs, and dense vegetation to hide and then open fire on coalition forces, often catching them off guard. The enemy's use of sniper fire and machine guns from elevated positions made it difficult for ground troops to effectively retaliate. The difficult terrain and lack of visibility meant that coalition forces could not always immediately identify the source of enemy fire, complicating their response. In addition to ambushes, the insurgents launched coordinated counterattacks aimed at reclaiming key areas that had been taken by coalition forces. These counterattacks were designed to force the coalition to spread their forces thinner, preventing them from consolidating their positions. Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters would often infiltrate behind coalition lines, conducting raids on supply depots, mortar teams, and communication centers. These counterattacks created confusion and forced coalition forces to divert troops to defensive positions, slowing the overall advance. The ambushes and counterattacks also exploited weaknesses in the coalition's strategy, particularly in the early stages of the operation. The initial assumption that the valley's enemy forces would be fragmented and disorganized quickly proved inaccurate. Instead, the insurgents displayed a surprising level of coordination and resilience, adapting their tactics to the situation and making use of their knowledge of the terrain. The enemy's ability to move quickly through the valley, often avoiding direct confrontation with larger coalition units, allowed them to strike at critical moments and then disappear into the landscape. These challenges led to a shift in tactics for the coalition forces. In response to the increasing frequency of ambushes, commanders began to adapt by deploying more specialized units, such as reconnaissance teams and counter-ambush squads, to identify enemy positions before they could launch attacks. Air support, including close airstrikes and surveillance drones, played a crucial role in helping troops detect and neutralize ambushes before they escalated. The ambushes and counterattacks in the Shah-i-Kot Valley were a stark reminder of the complexity of the battle, as both sides adapted to the ever-changing dynamics of the conflict. Despite the setbacks, the coalition forces persisted, learning from each engagement and adapting their approach in a constant effort to gain the upper hand. Role of air support and precision strikes. Air support and precision strikes played a critical role in the success of Operation Anaconda, particularly in the intense combat environment of the Shah-i-Kot Valley. The valley's rugged terrain and the enemy's well-entrenched positions made traditional ground assaults difficult and dangerous. The coordination of air power was essential not only for providing cover, but also for neutralizing high-value targets and breaking the enemy's defenses. Close air support (CAS) was integral to the operation's success, allowing ground forces to press forward with the backing of fighter jets, bombers, and attack helicopters. These air assets provided real-time surveillance and targeted strikes that were critical in softening up enemy positions before ground troops moved in. The U.S. Air Force and Navy, alongside coalition forces, were able to deploy various aircraft, including A-10 Thunderbolt II attack planes and AC-130 gunships, which were specially designed to operate in close proximity to friendly forces while delivering devastating firepower. These planes became a constant presence overhead, providing security for the troops on the ground. Precision strikes, often using smart bombs or laser-guided munitions, allowed for highly accurate targeting of enemy bunkers, caves, and artillery positions. These weapons minimized collateral damage while targeting specific, fortified locations where the insurgents were heavily entrenched. The use of drones, such as the MQ-1 Predator, provided commanders with critical intelligence and real-time video feeds, further enhancing the precision of airstrikes. Drones also offered a persistent presence, monitoring enemy movements and adjusting air support to respond to dynamic battlefield conditions. Air support also proved invaluable in breaking the stalemate when enemy forces launched counterattacks or ambushes. With the insurgents hiding in caves and well-defended positions, traditional artillery and infantry tactics could not always penetrate their defenses. Precision-guided bombs and missile strikes were used to target these fortifications, causing significant damage to enemy strongholds and reducing their ability to coordinate attacks. Additionally, close air support helped to suppress enemy mortar and machine gun positions, which were often positioned in elevated areas, giving the insurgents an advantage over coalition forces. Despite the effectiveness of air support, the coordination required to ensure its success was complex and required constant communication between ground commanders, pilots, and intelligence officers. The risk of friendly fire, especially in such a close and dynamic battle environment, was a constant concern. However, the synergy between air and ground forces ultimately played a decisive role in the coalition's ability to overcome the enemy's defenses, allowing the ground forces to make steady progress through the valley. The role of air support and precision strikes in Operation Anaconda demonstrated the increasing importance of integrated air-ground operations in modern warfare. These assets not only provided strategic advantages, but also highlighted the power of technology and coordination in overcoming complex and hostile environments. Adapting to mountain warfare. The harsh and unforgiving terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley posed significant challenges for the coalition forces during Operation Anaconda, forcing them to adapt their strategies to the demands of mountain warfare. The steep slopes, narrow valleys, and unpredictable weather conditions of the region tested the endurance and flexibility of the troops. These challenges required a shift in tactics, training, and equipment to ensure success against a well-entrenched and determined enemy. Mountain warfare, by nature, demands that troops operate in a highly disciplined and coordinated manner. The steep, rocky terrain made conventional movement difficult, requiring infantry and armored units to adjust their approach. Troops could not rely on traditional road-based movement, and maneuvering forces through the difficult landscape meant operating in smaller, more mobile units. Infantry squads and special operations teams often had to scale mountainsides or navigate narrow ravines to approach enemy positions, while air mobility became essential for rapid insertion and resupply. The adaptation to mountain warfare also involved the use of specialized equipment. Soldiers relied heavily on climbing gear, ropes, and other mountaineering tools to traverse the rugged landscape. Vehicles that were typically used in flat terrain, such as tanks and armored personnel carriers, were often unable to reach key areas, so troops had to rely more on foot movement or lighter vehicles capable of maneuvering through rough terrain. The use of helicopters for troop insertion, resupply, and evacuation became indispensable, as they could deliver forces directly to difficult-to-reach areas and extract wounded personnel from hazardous zones. Weather conditions in the mountains added another layer of complexity. Extreme cold, dust storms, and fog made visibility limited, further complicating the already challenging terrain. Temperature fluctuations could freeze equipment or cause equipment malfunctions, requiring troops to be prepared for the elements at all times. These unpredictable weather conditions also affected air support, with helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft having to adjust to changing conditions to maintain effective coverage and minimize the risk of accidents. The need for adaptability extended to tactics as well. The enemy, familiar with the terrain, utilized guerrilla tactics, taking advantage of natural cover to launch ambushes and disrupt coalition advances. In response, coalition forces had to rely on their ability to adapt quickly, adjusting tactics in real time to counter enemy movements. Special operations forces were crucial in providing intelligence, scouting ahead, and conducting surgical strikes on high-value targets, while conventional forces coordinated to secure key areas and protect supply lines. Adapting to mountain warfare in Operation Anaconda was not only about adjusting to the environment, but also about evolving the mindset of the troops. The operation highlighted the importance of flexibility, resourcefulness, and determination in overcoming the difficult challenges of the terrain, marking a critical shift in how modern armies approach warfare in harsh environments. Chapter 5: Key Allied Contributions. The success of Operation Anaconda was not solely the result of U.S. forces. The contributions of key Allied nations played a crucial role in the operation's execution and overall effectiveness. A coalition of international forces, including troops from the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and several other NATO countries, provided critical support in various operational areas. These allies brought unique capabilities, specialized skills, and a level of cooperation that significantly strengthened the mission's impact in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. One of the most significant Allied contributions came from the United Kingdom, which provided vital ground troops and special forces. British Army units, including elite commandos from the Special Air Service, SHASH, worked alongside U.S. Special Operations Forces in intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and direct action missions. The British forces were well versed in conducting operations in challenging environments, and their expertise in mountain warfare and counterinsurgency tactics proved invaluable in navigating the rugged terrain and securing key positions in the valley. Canada also played a pivotal role in the operation, particularly through the deployment of infantry units and combat engineers. The Canadian forces, who had a long history of participation in peacekeeping and combat operations, integrated seamlessly with their U.S. counterparts. They were instrumental in securing critical routes for troop movement and supply lines, as well as providing vital engineering support to clear obstacles and fortify positions. Additionally, Canadian snipers provided critical fire support, targeting key insurgent positions and contributing to the overall success of the mission. Australia's contribution to the operation was focused on air support and reconnaissance. Australian Air Forces, operating alongside US and British units, provided surveillance and intelligence gathering, often using aircraft and drones to monitor insurgent movements in real time. The Australian Defence Force, ADF, also assisted with close air support missions, targeting Taliban and Al-Qaeda positions that were heavily fortified in the mountains. Their ability to operate in conjunction with other coalition forces helped to ensure that air support was precise and coordinated with ground movements. Other nations, including Germany, France, and several former Soviet republics, contributed in various capacities, ranging from logistical support to medical assistance and peacekeeping operations in areas not directly involved in combat. The coordination between these allied forces was critical to maintaining a unified and efficient operation. The success of Operation Anaconda highlighted the strength of international cooperation in modern warfare. The diverse contributions of Allied forces, whether through ground combat, air support, or logistical assistance, were instrumental in overcoming the challenges of the Shah-i-Kot Valley. Their involvement ensured that the operation could be conducted efficiently, with minimal friction between multinational forces, ultimately leading to a successful and decisive campaign against Taliban and al-Qaeda forces. Afghan forces and their role in the operation. The involvement of Afghan forces in Operation Anaconda was a crucial aspect of the mission, providing valuable local knowledge and support in the fight against Taliban and al-Qaeda forces in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. Afghan soldiers and militia fighters, despite being relatively inexperienced compared to their coalition counterparts, played an essential role in the success of the operation by bolstering the strength of the coalition and contributing to the overall strategy in significant ways. The Afghan National Army (ANA) and local militia forces were integrated into the broader coalition efforts, participating in ground operations, securing key terrain, and providing intelligence about the Taliban and al-Qaeda presence. While Afghan forces had been severely weakened by years of conflict and Taliban rule, their participation in the operation marked a critical step in rebuilding the country's military capacity and sovereignty. The Afghan troops, familiar with the local terrain and culture, provided an invaluable resource to the coalition, especially in terms of intelligence gathering and navigating the mountainous landscape. Afghan forces also assisted in securing local populations and infrastructure, preventing insurgents from gaining support among the civilian population. Their presence helped to stabilize areas that had been previously under Taliban control, providing reassurance to local civilians that the international community was committed to their security. In addition, Afghan forces participated in cordon and search operations, helping to locate and neutralize Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters hiding in caves and fortified positions. However, despite their contributions, Afghan forces faced significant challenges during the operation. Many of them lacked advanced training and equipment, and their ability to conduct coordinated combat operations was limited. This made them reliant on coalition forces for critical support, including airstrikes, logistical aid, and specialized training. As the operation progressed, Afghan forces were able to learn from their more experienced allies, enhancing their combat skills and becoming more effective as the operation unfolded. The participation of Afghan forces in Operation Anaconda highlighted the importance of local partnerships in modern military operations. While their role was not as prominent as that of coalition forces, the Afghan troops provided crucial support in securing territory and gathering intelligence. Their involvement also helped to foster goodwill among the Afghan population, showing that the new Afghan government was capable of contributing to the security and stability of their country. Ultimately, the operation played a key role in the ongoing rebuilding of Afghanistan's military and governance structures, paving the way for future operations to maintain peace and security in the region. U.S. Special Operations Forces in action. U.S. Special Operations Forces (SOF) played a pivotal role in Operation Anaconda, showcasing their unmatched skills in executing complex and high-risk missions in the heart of enemy territory. Deployed alongside conventional forces, SOF units, including the Army Special Forces, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers, brought unparalleled expertise in direct action, unconventional warfare, and counterterrorism operations. Their ability to operate in small specialized teams allowed them to conduct precise, high-impact missions, often deep within enemy-controlled areas. One of the most significant contributions of U.S. SOF was their role in intelligence gathering. Prior to the large-scale ground assault, special operations teams infiltrated the Shah-i-Kot Valley, gathering critical information about Taliban and al-Qaeda forces. These teams, often working in small groups, relied on their training in stealth and survival to blend into the environment, collect intelligence, and mark targets for airstrikes. Their ability to operate behind enemy lines helped guide coalition forces, allowing them to strike with precision and minimize collateral damage. In addition to intelligence gathering, USSOF was involved in direct action missions that included targeting high-value individuals, disrupting enemy command and control structures, and capturing or killing key insurgent leaders. These operations required the highest level of coordination, as special operations teams worked alongside conventional forces and air support to neutralize the enemy's leadership and logistical capabilities. SOF units were also tasked with locating and destroying enemy weapons caches and disrupting supply lines, preventing the Taliban and al-Qaeda from reinforcing their positions. Another critical role played by USSOF during the operation was providing training and support to Afghan forces. Special forces teams in particular worked closely with the Afghan military and local militias, helping to build their combat capabilities. This partnership was essential for the long-term stability of Afghanistan, as it helped to lay the foundation for a more capable and self-sufficient Afghan security force. The training focused on tactics, leadership, and the ability to conduct joint operations with coalition forces, ultimately strengthening the Afghan military's ability to defend their territory. Throughout Operation Anaconda, U.S. Special Operations Forces demonstrated their flexibility, resilience, and mastery of unconventional warfare. Their efforts were integral not only to the success of the operation, but also to the broader strategy of counterinsurgency and nation-building in Afghanistan. The operation underscored the importance of special operations in modern warfare, where their ability to execute precise and high-impact missions can turn the tide of battle. Involvement of NATO and international allies. The success of Operation Anaconda was not solely dependent on the United States. It was a multinational effort supported by NATO and other international allies. This coalition brought together a diverse range of military capabilities, which were crucial in executing a complex operation in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. NATO forces, along with allies from other nations, provided critical air support, ground troops, logistics, intelligence, and specialized expertise, all of which contributed to the success of the mission. One of the most significant contributions came from NATO's European members. The United Kingdom in particular played a vital role in providing both ground and air support. British forces, including elite units such as the Special Air Service, SHASH, worked in close coordination with U.S. Special Operations teams. The SAS's expertise in conducting operations in harsh terrains, along with their ability to gather intelligence and disrupt enemy networks, was invaluable. British troops also assisted with securing key terrain and performing tasks, such as handling prisoners and maintaining control of captured areas. Other NATO members, such as Canada and Australia, also made substantial contributions. Canadian infantry and combat engineers were integrated into coalition forces, providing essential manpower to secure critical positions and improve infrastructure in the operational area. Canada's contribution was also felt in their role as a key partner in intelligence sharing, where Canadian forces worked alongside their U.S. counterparts to process and act on gathered information. Australia, on the other hand, provided crucial air support and reconnaissance. Their air forces contributed to surveillance missions and targeted strikes, greatly enhancing the overall effectiveness of air operations. Beyond NATO, the participation of non-NATO allies was also essential. Several nations, including France and Germany, lent support by providing logistical resources and participating in humanitarian efforts. These nations contributed to the supply and transport of troops, equipment, and medical assistance, ensuring that the operational tempo remained high despite the challenging terrain. Moreover, their involvement was also symbolic of the international commitment to the mission in Afghanistan, reinforcing the notion of a unified global effort to combat terrorism. The involvement of NATO and international allies highlighted the importance of multinational cooperation in modern warfare. The diverse contributions of these forces underscored the shared commitment to defeating Taliban and al-Qaeda forces, and ensured that the operation was conducted with a unified approach. Through this collaboration, Operation Anaconda demonstrated the strength of collective action, where each nation's unique strengths came together to achieve a common goal. Chapter 6: Challenges in Command and Communication. Operation Anaconda, like many large-scale military operations, faced significant challenges in command and communication, which were further exacerbated by the harsh terrain and the presence of a complex enemy. Effective coordination between the coalition forces was essential for success, but the operation underscored the difficulty of maintaining clear and efficient communication across a multinational force operating in a remote and hostile environment. One of the key issues was the difficulty in establishing and maintaining reliable communication networks in the rugged, mountainous terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley. The valley's steep slopes, narrow passes, and limited infrastructure made it hard to set up the necessary communication infrastructure for real-time coordination. The use of satellite communications, radios, and other electronic means was frequently hampered by the geography and weather conditions. In some areas, signals were blocked, leading to communication blackouts between ground forces and their commanders. This lack of reliable communication often delayed the execution of planned operations and created confusion, particularly when rapid adjustments were needed during combat. In addition to terrain-related issues, the multinational nature of the coalition added another layer of complexity to the command structure. While the U.S. military had the largest and most advanced force, coordinating with NATO and other allied nations required the integration of different command protocols, languages, and communication systems. This made it difficult to ensure that all parties were on the same page, especially when time-sensitive decisions had to be made in the heat of battle. The differences in command structures and the need to operate in a unified manner sometimes led to coordination delays and tactical inefficiencies. The high-intensity nature of the operation also created challenges in maintaining situational awareness. Commanders needed to make decisions based on rapidly changing information, and without effective communication, it was difficult to gain a clear understanding of the battlefield. Air support and artillery strikes, which were vital to the success of the mission, required precise coordination with ground forces. If communication between air and ground units was interrupted, it could lead to misfires, friendly fire incidents, or missed targets, further complicating an already difficult operation. Despite these challenges, the ability of the coalition forces to adapt and overcome communication difficulties demonstrated the resilience and resourcefulness of the military leadership. The lessons learned from these command and communication challenges have influenced the evolution of joint and multinational military operations, improving the efficiency and effectiveness of future missions. The experience gained in Operation Anaconda highlighted the importance of establishing robust and flexible communication networks, especially when operating in demanding environments. Coordination between ground and air units. Effective coordination between ground and air units was a crucial element of Operation Anaconda's success. The operation, which took place in the rugged and challenging terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley, required seamless integration of various military branches and allied forces. Air support played a pivotal role in providing real-time intelligence, conducting airstrikes and supplying troops, while ground forces engaged in direct combat and secured key terrain. The collaboration between these two components, however, was fraught with challenges that required rapid adjustments and careful planning. One of the primary functions of air support was to provide reconnaissance and surveillance. Aircraft, including helicopters and unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, were deployed to gather intelligence on Taliban and al-Qaeda positions. This aerial reconnaissance was essential in identifying targets, tracking enemy movements, and assisting in the planning of ground troop advances. However, the mountainous terrain often posed obstacles for clear visibility, complicating the accuracy of air surveillance. Communication between air units and ground forces had to be precise and constant to ensure that intelligence was shared effectively, which required well-established communication channels. The role of close air support, CAs, was another critical element in the coordination between ground and air units. Airstrikes were used to target enemy strongholds, weapon caches, and supply lines, which were vital for disrupting Taliban and al-Qaeda operations. These strikes, however, had to be carefully coordinated with ground forces to avoid friendly fire incidents and ensure that air assets were used where most needed. Communication between ground commanders and pilots was vital in directing air assets to the right targets at the right time. This coordination often occurred in real time, with ground forces providing updated target information as they moved through the valley. Logistical support from air units was also integral to the success of the operation. In a landscape where roads were either non-existent or impassable, air transport was the primary means of resupplying ground units. Helicopters delivered ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements, ensuring that troops could maintain their operational momentum. Without airlift support, it would have been nearly impossible for ground forces to sustain their presence in such a remote and isolated environment. Despite the complexities, the cooperation between ground and air units during Operation Anaconda demonstrated the effectiveness of joint operations in modern warfare. The lessons learned from this coordination helped refine tactics and improve the integration of air and ground forces in subsequent operations, contributing to more effective military strategies in challenging environments. Friction between different command levels. Operation Anaconda revealed significant friction between different command levels, which posed challenges to the effectiveness and execution of the mission. The complex coordination required for such a large-scale operation, involving multinational forces and diverse military branches, highlighted the inherent difficulties in managing both strategic and tactical levels of command. This friction, though not unusual in large operations, affected the speed and flexibility of decision-making, with consequences that influenced the operational outcome. At the highest levels, strategic decisions were often driven by national priorities and the overarching goals of the coalition. While these strategic objectives were clear, defeating Taliban and al-Qaeda forces in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, the implementation of these goals on the ground required constant coordination between various military units, many of which had different command structures, priorities, and operational capabilities. The tension between achieving political objectives and executing military operations led to differing interpretations of the mission's scope, often resulting in conflicting approaches to tactics and timing. Senior commanders, for instance, had to balance the necessity of overwhelming force with the desire to minimize civilian casualties and collateral damage, leading to some delays in decision-making. At the operational level, friction emerged between coalition commanders and their subordinate units. While the U.S. military had the largest presence and command influence, the integration of NATO and Afghan forces required delicate negotiations on how best to employ diverse forces with varying levels of capability and experience. Language barriers, cultural differences, and divergent operational practices often caused misunderstandings and slowed the decision-making process. Coalition forces were also trying to integrate Afghan forces, who, despite their local knowledge and invaluable support, often struggled with coordination and basic military skills, further complicating communication between commanders. On the tactical level, friction occurred between ground commanders and air support units, particularly when airstrikes had to be delayed or rerouted due to changes in ground troop positions. The absence of real-time, accurate communication sometimes led to misdirected strikes or instances of friendly fire, which further heightened the tension between different command levels. Ground commanders required immediate air support to suppress enemy fire and provide strategic advantages, while air commanders needed to ensure that strikes were carefully coordinated to avoid causing unnecessary harm to troops. Despite these challenges, the friction between command levels also offered valuable lessons in military leadership, joint operations, and inter-coalition coordination. It emphasized the need for clear communication, flexible command structures, and a shared understanding of mission objectives to streamline operations in future joint and multinational engagements. Friendly fire and miscommunication incidents. During Operation Anaconda, friendly fire and miscommunication incidents underscored the high-risk nature of large-scale, multinational military operations. In the challenging terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley, where air support, ground forces, and different coalition units had to work in close coordination, the chances for misunderstandings and tragic errors were heightened. These incidents highlighted the difficulties in communication, especially when operating in environments with limited visibility, harsh weather, and conflicting operational priorities. One of the most significant issues was the difficulty of coordinating air support with ground operations. While close air support (CAS) was crucial for suppressing enemy positions and providing firepower, the ever-changing landscape of the battlefield, combined with the challenges of maintaining precise communication, led to incidents of friendly fire. For example, ground forces occasionally came under attack from aircraft or artillery that had misidentified their positions. In one instance, confusion over radio frequencies and unclear target identification led to an airstrike hitting friendly forces. Such mistakes resulted in casualties and created a temporary breakdown in the trust between air and ground units. Additionally, the multinational nature of the coalition added another layer of complexity to communication and target identification. Different military units operated with different equipment, languages, and operational procedures, making it more difficult to maintain a unified and efficient communication flow. Misunderstandings between U.S. forces, NATO allies, and Afghan troops sometimes led to troops firing on each other or failing to relay critical information in real time. Language barriers and the stress of combat only exacerbated these issues, causing confusion over where friendly forces were positioned and how they were advancing. The consequences of these incidents were not only immediate in terms of casualties, but also affected the morale and cohesion of the troops involved. Friendly fire and miscommunications can create a sense of distrust between units and can complicate the chain of command, as leaders must address these errors while keeping their forces focused on the mission. The loss of life and the impact on unit cohesion were sobering reminders of the importance of maintaining clear and accurate communication, especially in high-intensity operations. Despite these challenges, Operation Anaconda also provided important lessons in improving coordination and communication in future operations. The incidents highlighted the need for more robust joint training, better integration of communication systems, and a more effective understanding of the terrain and enemy positions. These lessons have since been incorporated into modern military tactics to reduce the risk of friendly fire and improve inter-unit communication. Chapter 7: Turning the Tide. As Operation Anaconda progressed, the coalition forces faced mounting resistance from entrenched Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. Despite initial setbacks, including unexpected resistance and difficulties in coordination, the tide of the battle began to turn in favor of the coalition forces as they adapted to the dynamic combat environment. This shift was influenced by several key factors, including improved coordination between ground and air units, the reinforcement of troops, and the strategic use of intelligence gathered by Special Operations Forces. One of the critical turning points in the operation was the successful integration of air and ground assets. With the challenges of friendly fire and miscommunication largely addressed, the precision and effectiveness of close air support became a force multiplier for the coalition forces. Airstrikes, coordinated in real time with ground commanders, successfully neutralized Taliban and al-Qaeda positions, severely disrupting enemy forces and causing confusion within their ranks. The superiority of U.S. and coalition air power allowed for targeted strikes on key enemy strongholds, supply lines, and artillery positions, weakening the enemy's ability to mount a cohesive defense. Ground forces, particularly U.S. Special Operations Forces and their Afghan allies, also played a significant role in turning the tide. Through their persistent efforts to secure key terrain and disrupt enemy supply routes, they gradually pushed back Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters from their fortified positions. The experience and resilience of the special forces were vital in adapting tactics to the shifting dynamics of the battlefield. With the added support of conventional infantry units, these specialized troops were able to clear pockets of resistance and secure vital strategic points within the valley. Another important factor in the shift of momentum was the role of intelligence. Special operations forces, working in tandem with advanced surveillance technologies and UAVs, provided real-time intelligence on enemy movements and positions. This intelligence allowed coalition forces to execute more effective strikes and adapt their tactics accordingly. By the time reinforcements arrived, the coalition forces had gained the upper hand, taking control of critical areas in the valley and severely crippling the enemy's operational capabilities. By the conclusion of Operation Anaconda, the tide had turned decisively in favor of the coalition forces. While challenges remained, the operation demonstrated the importance of flexibility, coordination, and the ability to adapt in the face of evolving threats. The success of the mission marked a significant step in the broader campaign against the Taliban and al-Qaeda, setting the stage for future operations in Afghanistan. Reinforcements and strategic positioning. As Operation Anaconda continued to unfold, the arrival of reinforcements and the strategic positioning of forces played a pivotal role in shifting the momentum of the battle. The initial phases of the operation, marked by heavy resistance and communication difficulties, saw coalition forces struggle to secure key terrain in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. However, the timely arrival of reinforcements and the ability to reposition troops effectively allowed the coalition to regain control and force the Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters to retreat. Reinforcements came in several waves, with additional ground troops, air support, and logistical resources bolstering the capabilities of the initial assault forces. The arrival of more specialized units, such as U.S. Army Rangers and Marine Corps infantry, added to the fighting strength of the coalition, giving commanders more flexibility in executing tactics. These reinforcements not only provided additional manpower, but also helped to alleviate the pressure on existing units who had been engaged in combat for extended periods. With new forces in place, coalition commanders were able to launch more coordinated attacks, maintain a higher tempo of operations, and continue pushing forward against the entrenched enemy. Strategic positioning became a key factor in the success of the operation. The rugged terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley, which had initially posed a significant challenge to the forces, became more manageable as reinforcements arrived and were positioned at key locations. High ground positions, which were critical for both defense and observation, were seized and fortified by coalition forces, providing them with an advantage in terms of visibility and control over the battlefield. The ability to control these elevated positions allowed for more accurate targeting of enemy positions, while also ensuring that supply lines and reinforcements could be secured more effectively. Additionally, air assets were repositioned to provide consistent support to ground forces. The presence of helicopters for troop transport, resupply, and medical evacuation ensured that troops in the field remained well equipped and prepared to sustain operations. The repositioning of air support allowed for better coordination between ground and air units, ensuring that critical targets could be engaged swiftly and effectively. The combination of reinforcements and strategic positioning ultimately proved decisive in the success of Operation Anaconda. The coalition forces' ability to adapt, bring in additional resources, and gain control of key terrain allowed them to inflict heavy losses on the Taliban and al-Qaeda, significantly weakening their ability to resist and setting the stage for future military actions in the region. Use of high-altitude surveillance and drones. During Operation Anaconda, the use of high-altitude surveillance and drones played a critical role in providing real-time intelligence and enhancing the situational awareness of coalition forces. In the mountainous terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley, where visibility was often limited and enemy forces were deeply entrenched, traditional reconnaissance methods proved inadequate. To overcome these challenges, the integration of advanced surveillance technology, including high-altitude aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles (UAVs), proved to be invaluable assets. High-altitude surveillance platforms, such as reconnaissance aircraft, provided a bird's-eye view of the battlefield, offering commanders detailed imagery of enemy positions and movements. These aircraft could fly at altitudes that allowed them to cover vast areas of the valley, giving commanders crucial insight into the terrain and enemy activity without the risk of detection or engagement. The ability to monitor and map out the area from high above allowed for more accurate planning and execution of operations on the ground. The intelligence gathered from these platforms enabled coalition forces to pinpoint enemy strongholds, supply routes, and key locations, which were then targeted by ground forces or airstrikes. Drones, particularly UAVs like the Predator, were also central to the operation's intelligence-gathering efforts. These unmanned systems were capable of providing continuous surveillance over enemy positions, allowing ground commanders to track the movements of Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters in real time. UAVs provided critical feeds for both intelligence and targeting, enabling precision strikes on high-value targets. In addition, drones could be used for reconnaissance of hard-to-reach or highly dangerous areas, reducing the risk to manned aircraft or ground units. The use of UAVs also facilitated the coordination between air and ground forces. Drone operators could communicate directly with ground commanders, providing live video feeds that helped identify enemy locations and guide airstrikes. This real-time data exchange ensured that air assets were directed with precision, improving the effectiveness of air support and minimizing the risk of collateral damage or friendly fire. Overall, the integration of high-altitude surveillance and drones in Operation Anaconda significantly enhanced the operational capabilities of the coalition forces. These technologies provided a level of situational awareness and precision targeting that was essential for success in the challenging conditions of the Shah-i-Kot Valley, demonstrating the increasing importance of unmanned systems in modern warfare. Pushing back Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters. As Operation Anaconda progressed, one of the key objectives was to push back the Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters entrenched in the rugged terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley. The Taliban and al-Qaeda forces had fortified their positions and created a complex network of defenses, including caves and bunkers, making it difficult for coalition forces to gain ground. However, through a combination of strategic air support, precision strikes, and effective ground tactics, coalition forces gradually weakened the enemy's stronghold and began pushing them out of key positions. One of the most significant elements of the offensive was the integration of air and ground forces. Close air support (CAs) played a critical role in neutralizing Taliban and al-Qaeda positions. Precision airstrikes, directed by ground commanders and supported by real-time intelligence, were instrumental in targeting enemy strongholds, weapon caches, and logistical hubs. These airstrikes caused significant disruption to the enemy's command and control, forcing them to retreat or reorganize. However, the Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters were resilient, often regrouping in hidden or fortified positions, which required ongoing air and ground coordination to flush them out. On the ground, U.S. Special Operations Forces and Afghan allies led the charge against enemy positions. These elite units, with their knowledge of irregular warfare tactics, conducted direct assaults, clearing out enemy fighters from caves and bunkers. Their ability to move swiftly and adapt to the difficult terrain allowed them to maintain pressure on the enemy, forcing them to abandon key defensive positions. Additionally, conventional infantry units provided support, securing areas and ensuring that any enemy fighters attempting to regroup or escape were captured or neutralized. Despite their best efforts, the Taliban and al-Qaeda were unable to hold their ground for long. The combination of sustained pressure from both air and ground forces, the relentless pace of the operation, and the constant erosion of their resources and morale eventually forced them to retreat deeper into the valley or into neighboring regions. By the end of the operation, coalition forces had successfully pushed back a significant portion of the Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters, weakening their operational capacity in the region and marking a significant victory in the broader war on terror. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Tactical Evaluation. Following the conclusion of Operation Anaconda, a comprehensive tactical evaluation of the operation was conducted to assess its outcomes and identify lessons learned. The aftermath of the battle left both immediate and long-term implications for military strategy, highlighting both successes and areas for improvement. The operation had successfully inflicted significant losses on the Taliban and al-Qaeda forces, dismantling key strongholds in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, but it also revealed challenges in coordination, communication, and adaptability that would influence future military operations in Afghanistan and beyond. One of the primary successes of the operation was the effective use of air support and intelligence in neutralizing enemy positions. The integration of high-altitude surveillance, drones, and real-time intelligence gathering enabled coalition forces to strike key targets with precision, reducing collateral damage and increasing the operational efficiency of the mission. The combined effort of ground troops, U.S. Special Operations Forces, and Afghan fighters played a crucial role in securing strategic positions and clearing out entrenched enemy forces. The ability to adapt tactics to the challenging mountainous terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley also became a significant factor in overcoming initial difficulties. However, the operation was not without its challenges. One of the major issues that emerged was the friction between different command levels and the miscommunication that occurred between multinational forces. The coordination between ground and air units was critical, yet delays in communication and the complexities of operating with NATO and Afghan forces led to confusion at times. Friendly fire incidents and misidentifications, particularly in the early stages, highlighted the need for better integration and clearer command structures in future joint operations. The friction between various command levels and the difficulties in maintaining cohesion between diverse military forces exposed vulnerabilities that required corrective action. Additionally, the aftermath of the operation raised questions about the overall strategic approach. Despite the tactical success of pushing back the Taliban and al-Qaeda, the long-term impact on the broader insurgency was less clear. While the operation disrupted key elements of the enemy's infrastructure, it did not entirely eliminate the threat, and the insurgency continued to evolve and adapt. This realization prompted a re-evaluation of how future operations could better integrate counterinsurgency strategies with conventional warfare to achieve lasting stability in the region. The tactical evaluation of Operation Anaconda ultimately provided critical insights into joint military operations, intelligence integration, and the complexities of combating an insurgent enemy in challenging terrain. These lessons shaped future U.S. military strategies, contributing to the evolution of more effective counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and other conflict zones. Casualties and material losses. Operation Anaconda, while strategically significant in weakening Taliban and al-Qaeda forces, came at a considerable cost in terms of casualties and material losses. The battle in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, one of the most intense ground operations of the early stages of the War on Terror, exposed the harsh realities of combat in difficult terrain, where even the most well-prepared forces faced significant challenges. These losses had immediate impacts on the morale of the troops, and influenced subsequent tactical and operational decisions. The casualty rate, while not as high as some of the major battles in history, was still a sobering reminder of the cost of warfare. Coalition forces, including U.S. Army, Marines, and Special Operations units, suffered casualties from both combat engagements and the harsh environmental conditions of the valley. The rugged terrain, extreme weather, and altitude posed additional risks to the health and well-being of the troops, leading to injuries that were not solely combat-related. In total, U.S. forces reported dozens of soldiers wounded, with several killed in action. Afghan forces also sustained losses, with many local allies killed or wounded while engaging in direct combat with enemy fighters. In addition to the human toll, the operation also saw significant material losses. The use of heavy artillery, airstrikes, and ground combat led to the destruction or damage of several key vehicles and equipment. One of the most notable losses was the destruction of several helicopters, which were critical for troop insertion, resupply, and evacuation. The complex coordination required for helicopter operations in such challenging terrain led to the downing of at least one aircraft, contributing to both the loss of valuable assets and the loss of life. While the material losses were significant, the operation also highlighted the importance of resourcefulness and adaptability in the face of adversity. Many of the damaged or destroyed vehicles and equipment were either repaired or replaced with the rapid logistical support provided by the coalition. Despite these losses, the operation was deemed a success in terms of its strategic objectives, as it severely disrupted Taliban and al-Qaeda operations in the region and showcased the capability of U.S. and allied forces to conduct joint, large-scale operations in hostile and difficult environments. The casualties and material losses from Operation Anaconda served as important reminders of the sacrifices involved in military campaigns. These losses were not only mourned but also analyzed in tactical evaluations, driving improvements in operational strategies and equipment for future missions. The experiences of Operation Anaconda provided invaluable lessons for the future conduct of military operations, particularly in counterinsurgency and joint force coordination. Escape routes and remaining threats. While Operation Anaconda succeeded in dislodging Taliban and al-Qaeda forces from their positions in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, the operation did not entirely eliminate the threat posed by these insurgent groups. As coalition forces tightened their grip on key areas, many of the enemy fighters were able to exploit escape routes that allowed them to flee into the surrounding mountainous terrain, where the harsh environment and rugged landscape provided natural cover. These escape routes, though initially thought to be cut off, remained a significant factor in prolonging the insurgency in the region. The mountainous terrain of the valley, characterized by deep ravines and steep cliffs, played a crucial role in enabling the escape of many Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters. Despite the concentrated efforts of coalition forces to block these routes, the enemy was able to slip through gaps in the perimeter. The challenging geography of the region made it difficult to effectively seal off all escape paths, and many insurgents managed to retreat into remote areas where coalition forces had limited visibility and control. This not only allowed them to survive, but also to regroup and plan future attacks, sustaining the insurgency in the broader region. These remaining fighters, although pushed out of the Shah-i-Kot Valley, did not give up their fight. The operation had dealt significant blows to the Taliban and al-Qaeda's infrastructure, but it failed to decisively eradicate their leadership and supply lines. As a result, many fighters returned to their home bases in neighboring areas, particularly in the rugged mountains along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, where they could reorganize and rearm. These pockets of resistance became a persistent threat to stability in the region, as the insurgent groups maintained the ability to launch sporadic attacks on coalition forces, Afghan security forces, and civilian populations. Furthermore, the escape of these fighters led to a broader strategic challenge for the coalition. While tactical success had been achieved in the immediate area, the operational goal of permanently neutralizing the threat from the Taliban and al-Qaeda had yet to be fully realized. The survival of these insurgents necessitated ongoing counterinsurgency efforts, including intelligence gathering, surveillance, and targeted strikes. The operation underscored the difficulty of eradicating insurgent movements that could blend into the civilian population or retreat to safe havens in remote areas, requiring a long-term commitment to securing the region and addressing the underlying causes of the insurgency. In the aftermath of Operation Anaconda, the remaining threats posed by these escapees were a reminder that the battle against terrorism and insurgency was far from over. Lessons learned for future operations. Operation Anaconda provided several valuable lessons that shaped the U.S. military's approach to future operations, especially in the context of counterinsurgency and joint force coordination. The complexity of the operation, coupled with the challenges posed by the terrain and the enemy's tactics, highlighted both strengths and areas for improvement that would influence subsequent missions. One of the key lessons learned was the importance of better inter-unit and international coordination. The operation involved a large coalition of forces, including U.S. Army, Marines, Special Operations Forces, Afghan troops, and international allies. While the operation ultimately succeeded in its strategic goals, there were notable communication and coordination issues that led to delays and confusion, particularly between the different command levels and multinational forces. Future operations would benefit from clearer command structures and enhanced communication protocols, ensuring that all units are working in sync, particularly when conducting complex multidimensional missions. Another critical takeaway from Operation Anaconda was the importance of adaptability in the face of changing circumstances. The operation had been planned with the assumption that enemy forces would be more centralized and easier to target. However, the Taliban and al-Qaeda's ability to quickly adapt, employ asymmetric tactics, and retreat into difficult terrain forced the coalition to continually reassess their approach. In future operations, the ability to quickly adapt to shifting enemy tactics and terrain is vital, requiring flexibility in planning and execution. The role of intelligence in modern warfare was also underscored. The use of high-altitude surveillance, drones, and real-time intelligence was a game-changer in providing situational awareness and precision targeting. However, the reliance on intelligence gathering also exposed vulnerabilities in how data is processed and acted upon. To improve future operations, the military recognized the need for more effective integration of intelligence sources and better communication between intelligence units and operational forces. Real-time intelligence must be continuously updated and shared seamlessly to ensure that commanders can make timely and accurate decisions. Finally, the operation emphasized the importance of logistics and sustainment in prolonged combat. The difficulty of resupplying and maintaining forces in the mountainous terrain of the Shah-i-Kot Valley showed that future operations in similar environments would require more robust logistical plans, including more versatile transportation methods and better preparation for dealing with austere conditions. Overall, the lessons learned from Operation Anaconda led to significant adjustments in military strategy and tactics, particularly in counterinsurgency operations, joint force coordination, and intelligence integration, all of which would play a critical role in the success of future missions in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Conclusion. Operation Anaconda, launched in March 2002, was a pivotal moment in the War on Terror, marking the largest combined ground assault since the Gulf War. The operation's primary objective was to eliminate Taliban and al-Qaeda forces entrenched in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, an area that had become a stronghold for insurgent groups. While the operation achieved its strategic goals by weakening enemy forces and disrupting their infrastructure, it also highlighted the complexities and challenges of modern warfare, particularly in rugged terrain and against an elusive enemy. The operation underscored the effectiveness of air support, intelligence integration, and special operations forces in dealing with a well-entrenched enemy. Coalition forces, including U.S. Special Operations and Afghan troops, were able to leverage the terrain and superior technology to deliver precise strikes, forcing Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters to retreat. However, the operation also revealed the limitations of conventional tactics against an insurgent force that adapted quickly to the environment, using guerrilla tactics and exploiting escape routes to survive. The challenges faced during Operation Anaconda, including issues with communication, coordination among multinational forces, and difficulties in sealing off escape routes, shaped future military strategy. The lessons learned in the aftermath of the operation contributed to more effective joint force operations, improved intelligence sharing protocols, and a better understanding of the need for flexibility and adaptability in complex, multi-theater combat situations. While the operation inflicted heavy losses on the Taliban and al-Qaeda, it was clear that the insurgency was far from over. The remaining threats in the region and the ability of the enemy to regroup and adapt reinforced the long-term nature of the conflict. It became evident that military success alone would not be sufficient to achieve lasting peace and stability. The operation highlighted the need for a comprehensive strategy that combined military, political, and humanitarian efforts to address the underlying causes of extremism and insurgency. In conclusion, Operation Anaconda was a tactical success that disrupted the Taliban and al-Qaeda in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, but also revealed the enduring challenges of counterinsurgency and the necessity for continued adaptation in future military operations. The lessons learned from this operation have been integral to shaping subsequent military campaigns in Afghanistan, and have influenced global strategies for combating terrorism and insurgency.
Chapter 1: Historical Context of Women in Afghan Society. Afghan society, shaped by centuries of tradition, tribal customs, and waves of foreign influence, has historically positioned women within a framework defined by family, honor, and patriarchy. Before the eruption of continuous conflict in the late 20th century, Afghan women's roles varied widely, depending on their geographic location, social class, and ethnic background. In rural areas, women's lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, their activities closely regulated by tribal norms and Islamic practices interpreted through a conservative lens. In contrast, urban centers like Kabul offered a glimpse of a more progressive vision. During the mid-20th century, particularly under King Zahir Shah and the subsequent Republican period in the 1970s, women in the capital and other cities began to experience increased access to education, employment, and political participation. Education for women, though limited and largely dependent on location and family support, began to expand in the 1950s and 60s. Kabul University opened its doors to female students, and a growing number of women joined the workforce as teachers, nurses, and civil servants. These changes, while significant, were often seen as part of a broader modernization effort led by a relatively small urban elite. For the majority of Afghan women, especially in conservative tribal regions, traditional roles remained deeply entrenched, with girls marrying young and being expected to dedicate their lives to domestic responsibilities. The social and legal status of women also underwent gradual transformation during this period. The 1964 Constitution granted women the right to vote and run for office, and a number of progressive laws were enacted to address family issues and gender-based discrimination. However, the implementation of these reforms was inconsistent, and the tension between modernist reforms and conservative resistance continued to shape women's lives across the country. The contrast between rural and urban experiences highlighted the complexity of women's roles in Afghanistan. While a young woman in Kabul might attend university or become politically active, her counterpart in a remote village might never attend school or leave her home without a male escort. These disparities underscore the importance of understanding Afghan women's experiences not as a monolith, but as a spectrum shaped by geography, class, ethnicity, and shifting political regimes. This historical backdrop sets the stage for understanding how war would come to redefine, restrict, and in some cases expand the roles of Afghan women in the decades to follow. The legacies of both opportunity and oppression would echo through the tumultuous years of conflict, shaping the evolving story of Afghan women in war. Traditional gender roles before conflict. Before Afghanistan became engulfed in decades of war and foreign intervention, gender roles within the country were deeply rooted in tradition, shaped by tribal codes, religious interpretation, and patriarchal values. These roles were particularly rigid in rural areas, where cultural norms were often more influential than formal law. In such communities, a woman's identity was closely tied to her role within the family structure, primarily as a daughter, wife, and mother. Her status was often linked to the honor of her male relatives, and her behavior was seen as a reflection of the entire family's reputation. In this context, men were regarded as the primary breadwinners, protectors, and decision-makers, while women were expected to maintain the household and raise children. These expectations were passed down through generations and reinforced by religious teachings and tribal customs. While Islam as a faith grants certain rights to women, such as inheritance and education, cultural interpretations often skewed these rights, emphasizing obedience and domesticity as a woman's most valued contributions. Marriage was a central aspect of a woman's life, typically arranged by families and often occurring at a young age. Once married, a woman usually moved into her husband's household, where she was expected to fulfill duties to both her husband and his family. Her autonomy was limited, and decisions concerning her education, mobility, or employment, if considered at all, were usually made by male guardians. Inheritance laws, though codified in Islamic jurisprudence, were often circumvented in practice, further limiting women's access to land and wealth. Despite these constraints, women held influence within the domestic sphere. Mothers and elder women often played key roles in maintaining family unity and overseeing household affairs. In extended families, senior women could wield considerable authority over younger women, guiding them through their roles and responsibilities. In some tribal contexts, women also served as custodians of oral history and cultural rituals, passing down traditions through storytelling, songs, and ceremonies. It's important to note that even within this traditional framework, there were exceptions. In urban centers like Kabul, Herat, and Mazar-i-Sharif, elite families sometimes encouraged their daughters to pursue education and public service. Still, these were exceptions to the broader national pattern. The vast majority of Afghan women lived within a system that limited their public presence and prioritized their role within the home. Understanding these traditional gender roles is essential to grasp how the eruption of conflict would later challenge, reinforce, or in some cases, reshape the position of women in Afghan society. These deeply ingrained norms would serve as both obstacles and foundations, as women navigated the uncertainties of war and social upheaval. Social and legal status of women pre-war. Before Afghanistan was plunged into continuous conflict, the social and legal status of women existed within a complex intersection of tradition, religion, and evolving national reform. Legally, Afghan women made notable gains during the mid-20th century, particularly under the monarchy of King Zahir Shah and the Republican government that followed. The 1964 Constitution marked a significant turning point, granting women the right to vote and participate in parliamentary elections. It also opened doors for women to pursue higher education and work in the public sector, laying the groundwork for a gradual, albeit limited, shift in their legal status within Afghan society. However, these legal advancements were often confined to urban centers and rarely translated into tangible changes in rural regions, where tribal codes and customary practices held more authority than national laws. In many of these areas, women's lives were governed by unwritten but rigid social codes that defined their roles strictly within the home. Issues such as marriage, divorce, custody, and inheritance were often resolved through traditional councils or family elders, with little regard for state laws or women's individual rights. Education for girls was legally permitted and even encouraged by reformist regimes, but in practice, access remained highly uneven. In cities, girls attended schools and in some cases advanced to universities, becoming doctors, teachers, and civil servants. But in the countryside, conservative attitudes and logistical barriers, such as lack of nearby schools or female teachers, often kept girls from receiving even a basic education. Social pressure and fear of dishonor further discouraged families from allowing daughters to leave the home or engage in public life. In terms of personal freedoms, women's autonomy was limited by both legal structures and social norms. While they could, on paper, own property or initiate divorce, societal expectations made exercising these rights extremely rare. Male guardianship was a pervasive institution, with women needing a father, brother, or husband to make critical decisions on their behalf. Even in court, women's testimonies carried less weight than those of men, reflecting deeply ingrained gender biases within the justice system. Nevertheless, the pre-war period also saw the emergence of women who began to challenge traditional constraints. Female parliamentarians, activists, and professionals began carving out space for greater gender equity. Though their numbers were small, they planted the seeds for future advocacy and resistance, demonstrating that change, while slow and fragile, was possible. These early legal and social advancements would later become both a foundation and a battleground, as war redefined the position of women in Afghan society. Women in rural versus urban settings. The experiences of Afghan women before the outbreak of prolonged conflict were far from uniform, with stark contrasts between those living in rural areas and those in urban settings. These differences were shaped by varying degrees of access to education, healthcare, employment, and exposure to reformist ideologies. While women across the country were bound by overarching social norms rooted in patriarchy and tradition, the realities of daily life for women in a Kabul neighborhood differed significantly from those in a remote village in Helmand or Badakhshan. In urban centers such as Kabul, Herat, and Mazar-i-Sharif, women had more visibility and, in some cases, more opportunity. The mid-20th century brought a wave of modernization efforts that sought to bring women into the public sphere. Girls' schools were established, and higher education became accessible to some, leading to a modest increase in female professionals, teachers, doctors, and civil servants, particularly among the middle and upper classes. Urban women, though still constrained by societal expectations, were more likely to encounter reformist ideas and legal protections that encouraged limited participation in politics, the arts, and the workforce. These changes were supported by state policies and a growing awareness among some families of the value of education and public life for women. In contrast, rural Afghanistan remained largely untouched by these developments. Deeply rooted tribal customs governed everyday life, and women's roles were almost exclusively confined to the household and agricultural work. In many villages, girls did not attend school, and early marriage was common. The concept of a woman working outside the home or speaking publicly was often viewed as dishonorable. Healthcare access was limited, and cultural taboos frequently prevented women from seeking treatment from male doctors, further compromising their well-being. The physical and social isolation of rural communities further reinforced these gender norms. With little to no contact with urban progressivism or governmental institutions, rural women had few pathways to empowerment. Religious leaders and tribal elders wielded significant influence, often promoting conservative interpretations of Islam that prioritized female obedience and domesticity. Despite these challenges, rural women played vital roles in sustaining their households and communities. They worked in the fields, tended to livestock, and managed family life under difficult conditions. Their contributions, though rarely acknowledged publicly, were essential to the survival of their families. Meanwhile, urban women were beginning to advocate for more visibility and rights, setting in motion a quiet but significant push for gender reform. These contrasting realities highlight the diversity of women's lives in Afghanistan and underscore the importance of regional context in understanding both the barriers and the resilience of Afghan women before the war altered the social landscape forever. Chapter 2: The Soviet Invasion and its Aftermath. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked a pivotal turning point in the country's history, plunging it into a prolonged era of conflict that would fundamentally reshape Afghan society, including the lives of women. Initially, the Soviet-backed communist regime introduced sweeping reforms aimed at modernizing Afghanistan. Among these were policies promoting women's education, employment, and political participation, initiatives that challenged deeply entrenched patriarchal norms, especially in rural areas. However, these top-down reforms were often enforced with little regard for local traditions, sparking resistance and fueling a growing insurgency. For many urban women, particularly those already engaged in education or government work. The early years of the communist regime brought opportunities. Women were recruited into the workforce in larger numbers, trained as teachers and nurses, and encouraged to play a visible role in the nation's development. State-run literacy campaigns targeted women across the country, and some female leaders even rose within party ranks, symbolizing a break from the past. Yet this progress came at a high cost, as it was perceived by many as being imposed by an occupying power. In rural Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion was seen not just as a foreign occupation, but also as an assault on cultural and religious values. The regime's aggressive push for gender equality clashed with traditional norms, leading to violent backlash. Women who accepted government positions or allowed their daughters to attend school were often targeted by mujahideen fighters or ostracized by their communities. The conflict thus created a dangerous paradox. Women's visibility in public life was both a symbol of empowerment and a trigger for violence. The war itself exacted a devastating toll on women and families. As fighting intensified, many households were torn apart. Countless men were killed, imprisoned, or disappeared, forcing women into the role of sole providers. Displacement became a widespread reality, with millions of Afghans, many of them women and children, fleeing to refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. Life in these camps was harsh and uncertain, but it also introduced some women to new roles and skills, such as organizing community services or participating in aid programs. In the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, the country spiraled into civil war, leaving behind shattered institutions and deep social scars. While the communist reforms had temporarily opened doors for some women, the violence and instability that followed led to a dramatic regression in their status. Many who had stepped into public life were forced to retreat into private spheres once more, as the promise of progress gave way to the chaos of post-occupation Afghanistan. Impact on women's education and employment. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the subsequent years of political upheaval had a profound and complex impact on women's education and employment. Initially, the communist regime that took power with Soviet backing introduced aggressive reforms aimed at promoting gender equality. One of the regime's primary goals was to expand education and integrate women into the workforce, particularly in urban areas. For a brief period, these policies created unprecedented opportunities for women to access education and hold formal jobs, especially in sectors like healthcare, education, and government administration. In cities such as Kabul, girls were encouraged to attend school, and many did so with a sense of hope for a more equal future. Women became teachers, doctors, and clerks, visibly contributing to the social and economic fabric of the country. Government scholarships and literacy campaigns specifically targeted women, aiming to bridge the vast educational divide that had long existed. These reforms were supported by law and state policy, marking a rare era in Afghan history when the state actively promoted women's advancement in public life. However, this progress was not universally accepted. In many rural and conservative areas, the push for female education and employment was viewed as a threat to traditional values. The regime's forceful approach to implementing these changes, often without local consultation, bred resentment. In some cases, parents who sent their daughters to school faced threats from insurgent groups or disapproval from their communities. Women who took government jobs were sometimes labeled as collaborators and subjected to violence or social exclusion. Thus, while the reforms opened doors, they also made participation in public life a dangerous choice for many women. As the war dragged on, insecurity, displacement, and social instability severely undermined educational and employment gains. Schools were destroyed or abandoned, especially in conflict zones, and many families chose to keep girls at home due to safety concerns. Economic hardship pushed many women into informal or survival-based work, such as sewing, baking, or trading goods from home. In refugee camps, some women found opportunities to engage in community-based education or aid work, acquiring skills that would serve them in unexpected ways. Despite the turmoil, a generation of women emerged during this period who had experienced the transformative power of education and work. Their stories of resilience, ambition, and resistance would later fuel the women's rights movements that re-emerged after the Taliban's fall in 2001. But in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal, the space for women in schools and the workforce contracted once again, as Afghanistan plunged into deeper conflict and the hopes of lasting progress were put on hold. Emergence of women's resistance movements. Amid the violence and repression that followed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a quiet but determined current of resistance began to emerge among Afghan women. As traditional gender roles were destabilized by war, and as state-imposed reforms clashed with cultural norms, women found themselves navigating a space between forced change and forced submission. In this turbulent environment, women's resistance movements took root, not always as formal organizations, but often as networks of silent defiance, grassroots activism, and courageous acts of daily survival. One of the earliest and most influential forms of resistance came from women who insisted on the right to education. Even as schools were destroyed or shut down, and as threats from insurgents escalated, mothers, teachers, and students in urban areas like Kabul began organizing underground schools and private homes. These makeshift classrooms became sanctuaries of knowledge and empowerment, where girls were taught to read, write, and dream beyond the boundaries imposed by war and ideology. The act of teaching in secret or sending a daughter to such a school was, in itself, a powerful statement of resistance. Women also began forming support networks within refugee communities in Pakistan and Iran. In exile, away from the most restrictive environments, many women gained access to education, vocational training, and activism for the first time. Organizations such as the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, founded in 1977 but gaining prominence in the 1980s, provided a platform for outspoken opposition to both the Soviet-backed regime and the Mujahideen factions that perpetuated gender violence. RAWA operated schools, published literature, and held public demonstrations, often at great personal risk. Their activism helped amplify the voices of Afghan women on the global stage. Resistance also took deeply personal forms. Some women refused forced marriages, others hid books and radios to stay informed, and many took on leadership roles within their families when male relatives were killed or disappeared. These acts of quiet defiance laid the foundation for a growing consciousness among Afghan women, that their survival depended not only on endurance, but also on reclaiming agency in whatever ways they could. While these movements were fragmented and often operated in isolation due to the dangers of open activism, they marked the beginning of a legacy. They proved that even in the darkest moments of war, Afghan women could and would resist erasure. Their courage would echo in the years to come, inspiring future generations to continue the fight for dignity, rights, and a voice in the shaping of their nation. Displacement and the rise of refugee women. The Soviet invasion and the ensuing years of civil war led to one of the largest refugee crises in Afghan history. By the late 1980s, millions of Afghans had fled their homes, seeking safety in neighboring countries such as Pakistan and Iran. Among them were countless women who, often for the first time, found themselves navigating unfamiliar roles outside the traditional confines of home and family. Displacement, while traumatic, became a catalyst for transformation, giving rise to a new generation of Afghan refugee women who assumed leadership, survival, and advocacy roles in exile. Life in refugee camps was fraught with hardship. Overcrowded conditions, limited resources, and poor sanitation made daily existence a struggle. Women bore the brunt of this instability, responsible for securing food, caring for children, and managing households often without male support. Many had lost husbands or fathers to war, and suddenly found themselves as heads of families, roles they had rarely held in Afghanistan's patriarchal society. With no choice but to adapt, refugee women became resourceful and resilient, learning to navigate systems of aid distribution, healthcare, and education in foreign settings. Amid the chaos, some women began to seize new opportunities. In Pakistan, for example, refugee camps near Peshawar became informal hubs for women's education and vocational training. Non-governmental organizations and international agencies introduced programs aimed at empowering women through literacy, sewing, health education, and small-scale income generation. Many refugee women, having never stepped foot in a classroom in Afghanistan, learned to read and write for the first time. Others trained as teachers, health workers, and community organizers, roles that gave them a voice and influence within the camps. These experiences fostered a growing awareness of women's potential beyond traditional domestic roles. For some, displacement became a space of liberation, albeit within the context of immense suffering. The skills and confidence they gained in exile not only altered their individual lives, but also began to shift perceptions within their communities. They became examples of what women could achieve when given education and opportunity, even in the most adverse circumstances. Refugee women also began engaging in activism. They organized women-only spaces, created support groups, and even participated in policy discussions with aid organizations. Their stories began to surface in international media, and their needs and voices became harder to ignore. Though still marginalized and vulnerable, they were no longer invisible. Displacement shattered many lives, but it also ignited a quiet revolution among Afghan women. In the camps, stripped of home but not of hope, many women began a journey of empowerment that would shape the future of Afghanistan's struggle for gender equality long after the guns fell silent. Chapter 3: The Taliban Era. The rise of the Taliban in the mid-1990s ushered in one of the most repressive periods for women in Afghanistan's modern history. After capturing Kabul in 1996, the Taliban imposed a strict interpretation of Islamic law that effectively erased women from public life. Their regime, built on rigid fundamentalist ideals, enforced gender segregation and severely curtailed women's freedoms, dismantling decades of fragile progress in education, employment, and civic participation. Under Taliban rule, women were barred from working outside the home, except in rare circumstances such as in health care for female patients. Girls were forbidden from attending school beyond the age of 8, and even then, the curriculum was limited to religious instruction. Educational institutions for women were shut down across the country, and female teachers were dismissed from their positions. This policy created a generation of girls who grew up without access to formal education, deeply affecting Afghanistan's human development for years to come. Public life for women all but disappeared. Women were required to wear the burqa, a full body covering that left only a mesh screen for the eyes. Stepping outside without a male guardian, a mahram, was prohibited, and violations of these rules were met with brutal punishments, including public beatings and imprisonment by the Taliban's religious police, known as the Department for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. Women who had once worked as professionals or participated in civil society were forced into silence, fear, and isolation. The psychological impact of this systemic repression was profound. Women reported feeling invisible, trapped, and stripped of agency. The walls of their homes became their only world, and the sense of exclusion and despair permeated daily life. For widows and female-headed households, survival became particularly difficult, as they were not legally allowed to earn an income or even appear in public unaccompanied. Despite the dangers, resistance persisted in subtle and courageous ways. Underground schools, run by former teachers and supported by networks of families, quietly continued to educate girls in secret. Some women defied the restrictions to provide medical care or humanitarian aid. Activist groups like the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, continued to document abuses and smuggle evidence to the international community, keeping the plight of Afghan women in global consciousness. The Taliban era represents a dark chapter in Afghanistan's history, particularly for its women, whose rights and identities were systematically suppressed. Yet even in this time of severe oppression, seeds of resilience and resistance continued to grow, laying the foundation for a future struggle toward reclaiming dignity, education, and freedom. Systematic oppression and loss of rights. The Taliban's rule over Afghanistan marked an era of profound, systematic oppression, particularly for women. The regime's policies were not just a series of isolated decrees, but part of an overarching framework aimed at completely dismantling the rights and freedoms of women. Under the Taliban's strict interpretation of Sharia law, women's roles in society were drastically reduced, and their fundamental rights to education, employment, health, and even personal freedom were stripped away. One of the most immediate and visible impacts was the denial of education. The Taliban closed all girls' schools, forbidding girls from receiving an education beyond primary school, and even those who had attended school in the past were no longer allowed to study. Women and girls were prohibited from attending universities, and female teachers were dismissed from their jobs. This had devastating long-term effects on Afghan society, leading to a generation of women who lacked the knowledge and skills necessary for personal and professional development. As a result, the illiteracy rate for Afghan women soared, and many women were left with no means to support themselves or participate in public life. In the realm of employment, women were similarly disenfranchised. The Taliban barred women from working in most sectors, including government, healthcare, and education, unless they were involved in providing care to other women. This decision effectively erased women from the workforce, pushing them into the private sphere of home and family. Women who had been teachers, doctors, lawyers, or government workers were suddenly forced into unemployment, with no legal recourse to challenge their treatment. The oppressive policies also extended to personal freedom. Women were required to wear the full-body burqa when they went outside, a practice that restricted their movement and visibility. The burqa became a symbol of the Taliban's control over women's bodies and identities. Women were also not allowed to leave their homes without a male guardian, further reinforcing their dependency on male relatives for basic mobility. Those who defied these rules or were suspected of moral transgressions faced brutal punishment, including public floggings and stoning, meted out by the Taliban's religious police. The systemic nature of this oppression was not just about laws and rules, it permeated the very fabric of Afghan society. Women were reduced to their roles as wives and mothers, and their voices were silenced in both public and political spheres. The media, which had once shown glimpses of women in public life, became almost entirely male-dominated, and women's stories were largely absent from the national narrative. The loss of rights during the Taliban era was not just a political setback, but a personal tragedy for countless women. It robbed them of their dignity, autonomy, and opportunities to contribute to their communities. Yet, in the face of such oppression, many women continued to resist, creating underground schools, organizing secret networks of support, and silently defying the regime. The period of systematic oppression under the Taliban remains a painful chapter in Afghanistan's history, but it also highlighted the resilience of Afghan women, whose strength would eventually become a driving force in the push for their rights and freedoms after the Taliban's fall. Underground schools and acts of defiance. During the Taliban's regime, when formal education for girls and women was banned, many Afghan women and girls still sought ways to resist the oppressive policies that sought to erase their right to knowledge and freedom. Despite the risk of severe punishment, which could include imprisonment, beatings, or even death, women, teachers, and activists organized secret underground schools across Afghanistan. These schools became sites of both defiance and survival, offering young girls a chance to learn in private homes, basements, and other discreet locations, away from the prying eyes of the Taliban's religious police. The underground schools operated under extreme secrecy. In Kabul and other major cities, women teachers and concerned parents defied the Taliban's edicts by continuing to educate girls in subjects such as math, science, and literature. The lessons were often given in the dark of night or in concealed spaces, with the teachers and students facing constant danger. In some cases, women disguised themselves as men, and in others, the students used code words or symbols to identify their schools, ensuring that only trusted individuals could participate. The courage of the women involved in these underground schools cannot be overstated. These women, many of whom had been educated before the Taliban came to power, chose to risk their lives in order to preserve the intellectual and personal growth of the next generation. They became symbols of resilience in the face of oppression, providing not just education, but a form of hope to families trapped in a regime that sought to diminish their humanity. Beyond education, acts of defiance were pervasive in everyday life. Women found subtle ways to resist the Taliban's draconian rules. Some women used their status as mothers to protect their children from the Taliban's restrictive policies by hiding forbidden materials or organizing informal gatherings. Others continued to work in clandestine ways, providing health care or organizing community-based services to support women and families in need. These acts of defiance, though small in scale, served as a continuous reminder of the Afghan women's determination to survive and resist. The underground schools and acts of resistance also helped maintain a sense of Afghan identity and culture. While the Taliban attempted to erase the rights and freedoms of women, these secretive efforts ensured that Afghan girls and women had the knowledge to contribute to the future rebuilding of their country. The quiet revolution that occurred within these hidden spaces was a testament to the unyielding spirit of Afghan women, whose strength and determination would play a pivotal role in the nation's post-Taliban recovery and the resurgence of women's rights. Psychological and social consequences. The impact of the Taliban regime on Afghan women went beyond the physical restrictions imposed upon them. It left deep psychological and social scars that continue to affect Afghan society today. The systemic oppression and loss of rights under the Taliban created a climate of fear, isolation, and trauma for many women, particularly those who had once enjoyed a degree of freedom before the regime's rise to power. The enforced silence of public life, coupled with the constant threat of violence and punishment, led to a profound sense of hopelessness and disempowerment among women. The psychological toll of living under such conditions was immense. Women who were once professionals, educators, or activists were forced to retreat into the private sphere, often unable to express their frustrations or cope with their new restricted roles. The loss of identity and the enforced confinement to the home were particularly damaging, as many women had been active contributors to their communities and had formed social bonds outside the family. These restrictions not only isolated them from the outside world, but also eroded their sense of self-worth and agency. The trauma of this disempowerment became internalized for many, leading to feelings of depression, anxiety, and a sense of purposelessness. Socially, the consequences of the Taliban's policies were equally devastating. Women were no longer able to participate in the public and political spheres, effectively removing them from the decision-making processes that shaped their lives. Families, too, were affected by the Taliban's rules. The traditional Afghan family structure, already hierarchical, became further entrenched as men were granted exclusive rights to work and make decisions, while women were relegated to the domestic sphere. This deepened gender inequality within the home and led to heightened tensions, particularly in households where women had been previously independent or financially responsible. The repression also took a toll on intergenerational relationships. Young girls who grew up under Taliban rule were denied the opportunity to form friendships, develop their intellectual capacities, or interact freely with the opposite sex. Many of these girls internalized the oppressive norms and grew up believing that their worth was limited to their roles as daughters and wives. Meanwhile, older generations of women, who had experienced relative freedom in the 1970s and early 1980s, struggled with the trauma of regression, facing not only the loss of rights, but also the pain of seeing their daughters deprived of opportunities. The long-term social consequences of this psychological and cultural repression are still being felt in Afghanistan today. The trauma of the Taliban era contributed to cycles of violence, fear, and submission that many Afghan women are still working to break free from. Despite the resilience demonstrated by countless women during this period, the damage done to their mental health and social standing remains an obstacle that must be addressed in any future efforts to promote women's rights and social progress in Afghanistan. Chapter 4: Post-2001 Reconstruction and New Opportunities. The fall of the Taliban regime in 2001 marked a significant turning point for Afghan women, offering them a renewed opportunity to reclaim their rights and identities after years of repression. The international community, led by the United States and NATO forces, poured resources into the reconstruction of Afghanistan, with a particular emphasis on improving women's access to education, healthcare, and participation in the workforce. These efforts, while not without their challenges, brought forth new possibilities for Afghan women to regain their place in society and to actively shape the nation's future. One of the first and most visible areas of progress was in education. Following the Taliban's removal from power, millions of girls who had been deprived of schooling for years returned to classrooms. International organizations, NGOs, and the Afghan government worked together to rebuild and reopen schools, though the task was daunting, particularly in rural and conflict-prone areas. By 2010, the number of girls enrolled in school had risen dramatically, and many women who had been unable to complete their education during the Taliban era were able to return to school as adults, often participating in literacy and vocational training programs. The new opportunities in education laid the foundation for women's increased participation in the workforce and public life. Many women began to enter professions that had been inaccessible under the Taliban, including law, politics, business, and healthcare. Women held key positions in the Afghan government, and female entrepreneurs launched small businesses, contributing to the nation's economic recovery. Despite facing persistent cultural barriers and security challenges, women began to redefine their roles within Afghan society. Organizations like the Afghan Women's Network and the Afghan Women's Educational Center provided critical support, creating platforms for women to advocate for their rights and access services that had been denied for over a decade. Moreover, women's participation in political life also saw an encouraging increase. In the first post-Taliban elections, several women were elected to Afghanistan's parliament, marking a historic moment for gender equality in the country. Female civil society leaders, activists, and policymakers began to rise to prominence, advocating for women's legal rights, protection from violence, and access to justice. International funding for women's programs also played a crucial role, helping to create a more robust infrastructure for women's empowerment. However, despite these advances, the post-2001 period has not been without its setbacks. The continued influence of conservative cultural norms, ongoing violence from insurgent groups, and the slow pace of reforms in rural areas meant that many women still faced significant barriers to full participation in Afghan society. Nevertheless, the early 2000s marked a period of hope and opportunity for Afghan women, a time when they could envision and pursue a future that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. This period of reconstruction, while incomplete, laid the groundwork for future progress, even as Afghan women continue to face challenges in their pursuit of equality and justice. Role of international aid in women's development. Since the fall of the Taliban in 2001, international aid has played a pivotal role in advancing the rights and opportunities for Afghan women. The global community, recognizing the widespread oppression women faced under the Taliban, has invested considerable resources in supporting gender equality and women's empowerment in Afghanistan. This aid has come in various forms, including financial assistance, development programs, educational initiatives, and legal support, all aimed at addressing the deep-rooted inequalities and improving the lives of women in the country. One of the most significant contributions of international aid has been in the field of education. International donors, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and bilateral agencies like USAID, have funded the construction and rehabilitation of schools, particularly for girls, across Afghanistan. This effort has been crucial in providing Afghan girls access to formal education after years of Taliban rule, which had outlawed schooling for girls. By 2020, millions of girls were enrolled in schools, many of them for the first time in their lives. International aid has not only focused on building schools, but also on providing training for female teachers, which has helped to increase the number of qualified women educators in the country. In addition to education, international aid has been instrumental in supporting women's health and well-being. Organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO, and UNICEF have provided funding for maternal and child health programs, aimed at reducing Afghanistan's high maternal mortality rates. Healthcare services for women have improved, with more women gaining access to reproductive health services, prenatal care, and family planning options. The international community has also funded the establishment of women's health centers in rural and conflict-affected areas, providing life-saving medical care to women who would otherwise be excluded from such services. International aid has also played a crucial role in supporting women's economic empowerment. Through microfinance programs, vocational training, and small business grants, women have gained access to economic opportunities that were previously denied to them under the Taliban. Female entrepreneurs have been able to launch businesses, and women have started to participate in income-generating activities such as farming, handicrafts, and small-scale trade. These economic opportunities not only contribute to women's financial independence, but also help to challenge traditional gender roles, offering women a greater degree of autonomy. Furthermore, international aid has been essential in advocating for legal reforms that protect women's rights. Organizations like Human Rights Watch and the Afghan Women's Network have worked to raise awareness about gender-based violence and have lobbied for laws to protect women from domestic violence, forced marriage, and other forms of abuse. Through training and advocacy, international aid has helped to build a legal framework that supports the rights of women and provides them with mechanisms for seeking justice. Despite the many achievements facilitated by international aid, challenges remain. The security situation in Afghanistan, political instability, and cultural resistance to gender equality continue to hinder the full realization of women's rights. However, international aid remains a crucial lifeline for Afghan women, helping to pave the way for a future where they can achieve equality, independence, and participation in all aspects of society. Women in politics and public life. Since the fall of the Taliban in 2001, Afghan women have gradually made significant strides in gaining representation in politics and public life, although the journey has been fraught with challenges. The post-Taliban period ushered in a new era, where women were legally empowered to vote, run for office, and participate in civil society. International support and local activism have contributed to the growing involvement of women in political processes, but the deeply entrenched patriarchal norms and ongoing insecurity have made their participation in public life both an achievement and a struggle. One of the key milestones in the political participation of Afghan women was the first post-Taliban presidential election in 2004, which allowed women to vote and run for office. The Afghan constitution, adopted in 2004, guaranteed a minimum of 25% representation for women in the National Assembly, or Wolasi Jirga. This legal provision opened the door for women to take seats in parliament and have a voice in shaping the country's political future. Since then, women have steadily increased their presence in the legislature, with Afghan women holding key positions in government ministries, including those of women's affairs, education, and health. In addition to parliamentary representation, women have increasingly engaged in local politics. Many women now serve as provincial council members, and a few have even held positions as mayors of cities. Women in leadership roles have not only worked to advance women's rights, but have also addressed broader societal issues, including education, healthcare, and infrastructure development. Female politicians have used their platform to speak out against gender-based violence, push for laws to protect women, and advocate for more inclusive governance. However, the road to full political participation for women has not been without its hurdles. The pervasive insecurity in Afghanistan, fueled by ongoing conflict and insurgency, has often targeted female politicians and public figures. Women in politics are frequently threatened with violence, and some have even been assassinated for their activism. The political environment is deeply male-dominated, and while legal frameworks support women's participation, cultural attitudes still limit their influence. Women in public life often face hostility from conservative factions within society, making it difficult for them to achieve their full potential as leaders. Furthermore, the influence of women in Afghan politics remains constrained by the limited resources and networks available to them. Political patronage, corruption, and a lack of access to financial backing often prevent women from running competitive campaigns. Despite these challenges, many women have persevered, relying on grassroots support and forming alliances with like-minded activists and organizations. Women's participation in politics has slowly transformed the public discourse around gender, bringing women's issues into the political mainstream and challenging long-standing societal norms. In summary, while Afghan women's political participation has made notable strides since the fall of the Taliban, there is still much work to be done. The challenges they face, including security threats, patriarchal resistance, and limited resources, underscore the need for continued efforts to empower women and ensure their representation in all levels of governance. Nonetheless, the courage and resilience of women in Afghan politics serve as a testament to their determination to shape a more inclusive and equitable future for their country. Educational advancements and challenges. Since the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001, Afghan women have experienced a profound shift in access to education. Prior to this, girls were systematically excluded from formal education, with the Taliban regime's strict enforcement of policies that banned female education being one of the most visible forms of gender-based discrimination. After the regime's collapse, educational advancements for women became a central focus of both the Afghan government and international organizations. These efforts have resulted in significant gains in female literacy rates and school enrollment, yet challenges remain in ensuring that these advancements are sustainable and reach all segments of Afghan society. In the years following 2001, millions of girls returned to school, benefiting from the creation of new schools and the rebuilding of existing institutions. International aid played a crucial role in supporting these efforts, funding educational programs and teacher training initiatives. The establishment of schools in urban areas, particularly in Kabul, allowed women and girls to pursue primary and secondary education. Furthermore, the introduction of vocational and technical training programs has helped women gain skills that enhance their economic independence and access to the labor market. Higher education has also become more accessible to Afghan women, with an increasing number of universities admitting female students, leading to a rise in female professionals across various sectors. However, these advancements have not been without significant challenges. Rural areas where many women live still suffer from limited educational infrastructure. In some regions, cultural and religious beliefs continue to dictate that girls should remain at home, preventing them from attending school. The security situation, exacerbated by the presence of insurgent groups like the Taliban, has also hampered efforts to educate girls, as schools in rural and conflict-prone areas often face threats of violence or destruction. Girls in these regions are particularly vulnerable to attacks, abductions, or forced marriages, which makes the pursuit of education even more perilous. In addition to physical security risks, the quality of education remains a major challenge. While there has been a surge in the number of schools, many are still under-resourced, and a lack of trained teachers, particularly female instructors, hinders the quality of education offered. Schools are often overcrowded, and many girls are forced to attend makeshift classes that lack basic facilities. This disparity in educational quality between urban and rural areas further exacerbates gender inequality, as girls in rural areas have fewer opportunities for academic success and personal growth. Despite these ongoing challenges, educational advancements for women in Afghanistan have had a lasting impact. The women who have had access to education are reshaping society, challenging traditional norms, and proving that education is a critical tool in the fight for gender equality. Yet, for the progress to continue, it is essential to address the remaining barriers to education, security concerns, cultural resistance, and a lack of resources, so that all Afghan girls and women have the opportunity to realize their full potential. Chapter 5: Women in the Afghan Armed Forces and Police. The involvement of women in the Afghan armed forces and police is a relatively recent development, but it has become an important aspect of women's empowerment and gender equality in Afghanistan. Before 2001, the participation of women in the military and police forces was almost non-existent, as these roles were considered off-limits due to deeply ingrained cultural norms and the oppressive policies of the Taliban regime. The fall of the Taliban opened up new possibilities for women to engage in these traditionally male-dominated sectors, though the journey has been fraught with challenges. In the years following the fall of the Taliban, the new Afghan government, with the support of international allies, made significant efforts to integrate women into the Afghan National Army (ANA) and Afghan National Police (ANP). One of the primary goals was to ensure that women would have an active role in maintaining the country's security and in representing Afghan society in all aspects of governance. The recruitment of women into the armed forces and police forces was seen as not only a symbol of progress, but also as a necessary step in creating a security apparatus that reflected the diversity of the population. Women's roles in the ANA and ANP began with recruitment drives aimed at increasing female representation. This led to the establishment of training programs specifically for women, which included physical and technical training to prepare them for service. By 2010, the Afghan National Army had around 1,000 female soldiers, and the Afghan National Police had several hundred female officers. These women served in various roles, from patrolling the streets to participating in specialized units such as the Women's Police Corps, which dealt specifically with issues such as gender-based violence and crimes against women. Despite these gains, the challenges faced by women in the military and police are considerable. Cultural and societal resistance to women serving in such roles has been a major obstacle. Female soldiers and officers are often stigmatized by both their peers and their families, with many facing harassment, discrimination, and even violence. In a deeply patriarchal society, women in the armed forces and police must not only contend with the dangers of insurgent attacks, but also navigate the difficult terrain of gendered expectations. Women often find themselves excluded from certain units, denied promotions, or forced to work in less desirable positions. Moreover, the lack of adequate infrastructure and resources for women's participation in these sectors has been a persistent issue. There have been instances where women in the military and police forces were provided inadequate facilities, such as separate living quarters and restrooms, which undermines their ability to fully integrate into their roles. Additionally, the security situation in Afghanistan, exacerbated by the Taliban's resurgence in certain areas, has made it dangerous for women to serve in high-risk zones. Despite these challenges, the presence of women in the Afghan armed forces and police represents a significant breakthrough in the pursuit of gender equality. These women have become role models for younger generations, showing that women can contribute to the defense and security of their country. Their involvement in the military and police also sends a powerful message that women are capable of taking on leadership roles, even in the most difficult and dangerous of environments. The ongoing struggles they face, however, highlight the need for continued support and institutional reform to ensure that women can fully participate in Afghanistan's security sector and other key areas of public life. Recruitment and training of female personnel. The recruitment and training of female personnel in the Afghan armed forces and police have been central to the efforts to increase gender equality and promote women's participation in national security. Before the fall of the Taliban, the idea of women in the military or law enforcement was virtually unheard of. However, following the Taliban's defeat in 2001, the Afghan government, with the support of international partners, began to make strides in integrating women into the security forces. This shift was driven not only by a desire to improve gender equality, but also to reflect the full diversity of Afghan society within the armed forces and police. The recruitment of women into the Afghan National Army (ANA) and Afghan National Police (ANP) faced numerous obstacles from the outset. Cultural resistance was the primary barrier, as many in Afghan society viewed women in the military or police as a violation of traditional gender roles. However, significant progress was made through persistent efforts by the Afghan government and international organizations, which encouraged and funded recruitment campaigns targeted at women. These initiatives emphasized the importance of female representation in maintaining the security and stability of the country, as well as the necessity of women in addressing issues such as gender-based violence and human rights violations. Training female recruits to meet the demands of military and police service was a crucial part of this process. Female personnel in the armed forces and police were enrolled in specialized training programs, which included physical conditioning, weapons training, and courses on military tactics and law enforcement techniques. These programs were often designed to address the unique needs and challenges faced by women in the security sector. In addition to standard training, female recruits received education in women's rights, gender sensitivity, and the handling of cases involving violence against women. One of the key challenges in training women for these roles was overcoming the significant gender gap in physical fitness and military skills. Due to historical exclusion from educational and physical development opportunities, many women lacked the physical training required to meet the strenuous demands of the military and police. Special accommodations were made to address this gap, such as extended physical training sessions and mentoring by experienced female officers. These measures helped women gradually gain the skills and confidence required to succeed in these male-dominated fields. The training of female personnel was also complicated by a lack of adequate infrastructure and resources. Female recruits often faced logistical challenges, such as the absence of female-specific facilities like separate housing, bathrooms, and changing rooms. This made it difficult for many women to complete their training, as the environment was not conducive to their participation. Despite these setbacks, the women who did complete their training became a vital part of the security forces and began to fill positions that were previously inaccessible to women, such as patrolling the streets, investigating crimes, and engaging in counterinsurgency operations. In conclusion, while the recruitment and training of female personnel in the Afghan armed forces and police have made significant strides, the process is far from complete. Cultural resistance, physical challenges, and infrastructure limitations continue to affect the participation of women in these sectors. However, the increasing numbers of trained female soldiers and police officers in Afghanistan represent a transformative step towards gender equality and show that, despite the many obstacles, Afghan women are capable of playing crucial roles in the security and defense of their country. Social perceptions and resistance. The participation of women in the Afghan armed forces and police has not only been hindered by logistical and infrastructural challenges, but also by deep-rooted social perceptions and resistance. In a society that has long adhered to conservative and patriarchal values, the idea of women serving in such traditionally male-dominated roles is met with significant resistance from various segments of the population. This resistance stems from cultural beliefs about gender roles and the perception that women should remain in domestic spheres rather than engaging in public and potentially dangerous work. For many Afghans, the role of women in society has traditionally been centered around the home, focusing on child rearing, household management, and supporting their male relatives. The thought of women entering the military or law enforcement fields challenges this deeply ingrained cultural norm. Many perceive the roles of soldiers and police officers as too aggressive or dangerous for women, leading to widespread skepticism and opposition. These social attitudes are particularly prevalent in rural areas, where traditional views on gender roles are more rigid, and women's public participation is more limited. Resistance is also visible within the armed forces and police themselves. Male colleagues, often brought up in a deeply patriarchal environment, may harbor biases or even animosity towards female recruits. Female soldiers and police officers may face harassment, marginalization, or exclusion from certain tasks or leadership positions due to these attitudes. The pervasive notion that men are better suited for combat or law enforcement work is reflected not only in society's general outlook, but also in the attitudes of some male superiors and colleagues who may see women's presence as a challenge to their authority and role. In addition to resistance from male counterparts, many women who attempt to pursue careers in the military or police forces face opposition from their families or communities. In a society where honor and reputation are closely tied to the actions of women, families may resist their daughters or wives joining the military or police for fear of stigma or dishonor. The pressure from families to conform to traditional gender roles often leads women to choose domestic roles over professional ones, even when they have the desire and ability to serve in the armed forces or police. Social perceptions surrounding women's roles in security forces are not static, however. The presence of women in these sectors, particularly those who have excelled in their roles, has begun to shift public attitudes, especially in urban centers where education and exposure to alternative gender roles are more widespread. Women who serve as police officers or soldiers have become role models for younger generations, challenging the stereotype that women are incapable of such work. These women are not only contributing to the security of the nation, but also changing the narrative around women's capabilities and roles in society. Nevertheless, the challenges posed by social perceptions and resistance remain significant. For women to truly succeed in the armed forces and police, broader societal changes are needed, including shifts in cultural attitudes, improved support from families and communities, and a more inclusive military and police culture. Addressing these social barriers is crucial to ensuring that women can fully participate in the defense and security of Afghanistan and break free from the constraints imposed by outdated gender norms. Personal narratives from the front lines. The stories of women serving in the Afghan armed forces and police are powerful testaments to courage, resilience, and the desire to break free from societal constraints. These personal narratives from the front lines offer a glimpse into the challenges, triumphs, and sacrifices made by women who have chosen to serve their country in a time of conflict. These women, who have defied traditional gender norms to become soldiers, officers, and peacekeepers, have not only faced the dangers of war but also the harsh realities of cultural resistance and social stigmatization. One such narrative is that of Captain Malala, an Afghan National Army officer who served on the front lines of the conflict. Malala recalls the initial skepticism she faced from both her peers and her family when she joined the army. "Many thought I was crazy to join, especially given the dangers," she said. "But I knew I could contribute, and I wanted to prove that women could be just as strong and capable as men in combat." Malala's story is not an isolated one. Many women in the Afghan armed forces have had to overcome immense personal and social barriers to pursue their careers in the military or police. Women on the front lines also face the constant threat of violence, both from enemy forces and from within their own ranks. Sergeant Zainab, a police officer, speaks of the dangers of working in a male-dominated environment. "At times I feared for my life. But I knew that if I didn't show up, no one would take us seriously," Zainab shared. Her experience is a stark reminder of the unique risks faced by women in the security forces, where they not only have to combat external threats, but also navigate the complexities of internal resistance and discrimination. Despite these challenges, many women in the Afghan security forces find strength in their roles and the positive changes they are able to influence. Police Officer Shazia explains, "I work with survivors of gender-based violence, and knowing that I am able to make a difference in their lives gives me strength." These personal narratives reveal the profound impact that women in security roles can have on their communities, as they often serve as advocates for women's rights and gender equality, while simultaneously working to ensure the country's safety and stability. The stories of these women highlight their enduring determination and the crucial role they play in shaping Afghanistan's future. They serve as a powerful reminder that women, despite the obstacles they face, continue to redefine what is possible in a society that often limits their opportunities. Their personal narratives are not just about survival. They are about breaking barriers and making a lasting impact on their country's security and social fabric. Chapter 6: Female Journalists and Media Voices. Female journalists in Afghanistan have played a critical role in shaping the country's media landscape, especially in the post-Taliban era. Their contributions have gone far beyond just reporting news. They have been at the forefront of challenging societal norms, advocating for women's rights, and providing an essential voice for marginalized communities. Despite facing intense personal risks, societal resistance, and systemic barriers, many Afghan women journalists have managed to build careers that defy traditional gender expectations and have become influential figures in the media world. The role of female journalists in Afghanistan gained visibility after the fall of the Taliban in 2001, when the country saw a significant expansion of the media sector. Under the new democratic framework, the Afghan government, with the support of international organizations, sought to rebuild the media, and women began to take an active role in the news industry. The opening of private television channels, radio stations, and newspapers allowed women to express their voices more freely, with female journalists contributing to both national and international platforms. Some of the prominent figures in Afghan journalism include Shabnam Nasimi, who became a well-known TV host and journalist, advocating for women's rights, and Zara Hoya, who founded an Afghan news agency focusing on the stories of women and children. Despite these advancements, female journalists in Afghanistan face immense challenges. The country's security situation remains volatile, with journalists regularly targeted by insurgents and extremist groups. Women in the media are especially vulnerable to threats, harassment, and violence, both from the Taliban and from more conservative factions within Afghan society. For female reporters, the threat of sexual violence, public shaming, and even assassination looms large. The psychological toll of such risks often leads to self-censorship and limits their ability to report freely. In addition to security threats, female journalists encounter significant cultural and societal obstacles. Afghanistan's deeply patriarchal society often views women as secondary to men, and their roles in public life, especially in media, are seen as controversial. Many women journalists face opposition from their families or communities, who believe that a woman's place should be in the home rather than in the public eye. This societal resistance has made it challenging for women to pursue careers in journalism, especially in rural areas where traditional values are more deeply ingrained. Despite these barriers, female journalists in Afghanistan continue to push boundaries. They not only report the news, but also use their platforms to highlight important issues such as women's rights, education, and the impact of the ongoing conflict on civilians. These women are crucial voices in the fight for gender equality, and their courage to speak out under such extreme conditions makes their work all the more significant. As the media landscape in Afghanistan evolves, female journalists remain at the heart of a critical movement to empower women and amplify their voices in a society where their stories have too often been silenced. Risk and resilience in conflict reporting. The work of female journalists in Afghanistan has been marked by profound risks, particularly in the context of conflict reporting. Reporting from the front lines of one of the world's most dangerous regions requires immense courage, resilience, and a commitment to truth, especially for women in the media. These journalists often navigate the dual challenges of working in a war zone while also facing gender-specific threats, including harassment, violence, and cultural opposition. Yet, despite the severe risks, many women have not only continued to report, but have also become influential voices for social change. The dangers faced by female journalists in Afghanistan are manifold. The ongoing conflict, entrenched political instability, and the resurgence of the Taliban have created an environment where media workers, particularly women, are frequently targeted. Journalists risk bombings, ambushes, and kidnappings, and women in the field are especially vulnerable to gender-based violence, including sexual assault and public humiliation. These risks are compounded by the harassment faced by female reporters from both insurgent groups and conservative factions within Afghan society. The very act of reporting on sensitive issues, such as women's rights, corruption, or the impact of the war on civilians, often places these journalists in direct conflict with powerful groups that wish to silence them. Despite the dangers, Afghan female journalists have displayed extraordinary resilience. Many continue to report, even when faced with direct threats to their lives and personal safety. For example, some journalists have been forced to work undercover or change their identities in order to evade persecution. Others have relied on protective networks, forming alliances with fellow journalists, international organizations, and advocacy groups dedicated to press freedom and women's rights. This resilience, fueled by a deep commitment to their work, allows these women to maintain their roles as critical voices in the media landscape. In addition to the physical dangers, female journalists also contend with the mental and emotional toll of conflict reporting. The constant exposure to violence, trauma, and the personal loss of colleagues can lead to psychological stress, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. However, many women have found ways to cope with these challenges, using their platforms to highlight issues that matter to them, such as gender inequality, social injustice, and the stories of women and children affected by the war. This sense of purpose provides a powerful source of resilience in the face of adversity. In conclusion, the risk and resilience of female journalists in Afghanistan exemplify the strength and determination of women in conflict zones. Despite the dangers they face, these women continue to serve as a beacon of hope and truth in a society where their voices are crucial, yet often under threat. Their ability to withstand the hardships of conflict reporting and remain steadfast in their commitment to journalistic integrity underscores their essential role in the ongoing fight for freedom of speech and gender equality in Afghanistan. Advocacy through media and art. In Afghanistan, women have found powerful tools for advocacy through media and art, using these platforms not only to share their stories, but also to challenge societal norms, promote gender equality, and raise awareness about the issues they face. Both media and art have become significant outlets for resistance, empowerment, and social change, allowing women to give voice to their struggles and aspirations in a deeply patriarchal society. Media, particularly in the form of journalism, television, and social media, has enabled Afghan women to reach a wide audience, both nationally and internationally. Female journalists, for example, have used their work to shine a spotlight on human rights violations, the plight of women under the Taliban, and the ongoing challenges of living in a war-torn country. Through courageous reporting, they have not only informed the public, but also held those in power accountable for their actions. Moreover, social media platforms, despite their limitations in Afghanistan, have allowed women to engage in activism, advocate for political change, and connect with like-minded individuals both inside and outside the country. Art, in its various forms, has also become a vital tool for advocacy in Afghanistan. Women artists have used painting, photography, film, and music to express their emotions, reflect on their experiences, and comment on the social and political issues affecting their lives. In a society where women's voices are often silenced, art provides a non-verbal yet powerful means of resistance. For example, Afghan female filmmakers have produced documentaries and narrative films that explore the themes of female empowerment, the impact of war on women, and the struggles for freedom and justice. These works not only offer a platform for women's voices, but also serve as an essential form of documentation for future generations. Moreover, street art and public installations have become increasingly common in urban areas, where they challenge conservative views on women's rights and highlight the everyday violence women experience. These forms of art have the potential to reach a wide audience, especially in spaces where women might not traditionally have a voice, such as public squares, markets, and public transportation systems. The use of art in public spaces brings attention to gender inequalities and calls for social change in a visually impactful way. In both media and art, Afghan women have found the strength to express their identity, challenge oppressive systems, and call for a more just and equitable society. Through these creative outlets, they have not only found personal empowerment, but also contributed to a broader movement for gender equality and social reform in Afghanistan. Despite the risks involved, these women continue to push boundaries, using their talents to advocate for a brighter future. Censorship, threats, and the fight for free expression. In Afghanistan, the struggle for free expression remains an ongoing battle, particularly for female journalists, artists, and activists. Since the fall of the Taliban, women have made significant strides in using media and art as platforms for self-expression, advocacy, and social change. However, these achievements have been constantly undermined by the persistent challenges of censorship, threats of violence, and the stifling of free speech. Censorship in Afghanistan has taken many forms, ranging from state-imposed restrictions to the intimidation of media outlets and journalists. Under the Taliban's rule, the media was heavily censored, with women's voices particularly suppressed. Even in the post-Taliban era, censorship continues to be a powerful tool used to silence critical voices, especially those advocating for women's rights, gender equality, and political reform. The Afghan government, at times, has been complicit in restricting freedom of the press, especially when reporting threatens powerful interests or contradicts official narratives. These efforts to control the media landscape are particularly harmful to female journalists, whose coverage of sensitive topics often faces additional scrutiny and repression. The most pervasive threat faced by female journalists and media workers is the constant danger of violence. Journalists covering the war or gender issues, for instance, are at risk of assassination, kidnapping, or physical harm by insurgent groups, including the Taliban. Women in particular are targeted not only for their work but also for their gender, with many experiencing sexual violence, harassment, and threats from both militants and conservative factions within Afghan society. These threats create an environment of fear that forces journalists to self-censor or even abandon their work. For many, the decision to speak out or report is a perilous one, with the potential for severe personal consequences. In addition to these physical threats, the rise of online harassment has also been a significant challenge. Social media platforms, while offering new opportunities for women to voice their opinions, have also become spaces where female journalists, artists, and activists face cyberbullying, hate speech, and campaigns designed to discredit or intimidate them. The constant harassment online can have a chilling effect, forcing women to curtail their public presence or censor themselves to avoid further attacks. Despite these immense challenges, Afghan women have remained steadfast in their commitment to free expression. Many continue to report, create, and advocate, knowing that their voices are vital in shaping the future of Afghanistan. Their courage in the face of censorship and threats underscores the importance of protecting the right to free speech and supporting the work of women in media and the arts. The fight for free expression in Afghanistan is far from over, but the resilience of these women stands as a testament to their determination to bring about change, no matter the cost. Chapter 7: Women as Peacebuilders and Negotiators. In the context of Afghanistan's prolonged conflict, women have emerged as powerful and influential peacebuilders and negotiators. Historically marginalized in the political sphere, Afghan women have increasingly taken on roles as advocates for peace, contributing to the efforts of reconciliation, conflict resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction. Their participation in peacebuilding processes is critical, as they bring unique perspectives that not only address the immediate needs of society, but also promote long-term stability and gender equality. The role of women in peacebuilding has been recognized internationally, especially following the adoption of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, which calls for the active participation of women in peace processes. In Afghanistan, women have been instrumental in advocating for a peaceful resolution to the ongoing conflict. These women have not only engaged in formal peace talks, but have also played vital roles in grassroots peacebuilding, where they have mediated local conflicts, facilitated dialogue between communities, and worked to prevent violence. One of the most significant examples of female involvement in peacebuilding was the establishment of the Afghan Women's Network, AWN, which brought together women from across the country to advocate for women's rights, security, and inclusion in peace processes. AWN and other organizations have consistently pushed for a seat at the table in negotiations, arguing that any sustainable peace must take into account the needs and perspectives of women. Their advocacy has led to the inclusion of women in peace talks, including the 2020 U.S. Taliban agreement, where women's rights and participation in the peace process became key points of negotiation. Despite these advancements, the path for women in peacebuilding is fraught with obstacles. Cultural and societal norms, particularly in more conservative regions, have often resisted the idea of women engaging in politics or peace negotiations. Furthermore, the violence and instability that continue to plague the country create an environment where women's contributions are often undervalued or ignored. Nonetheless, many Afghan women have persisted, using their platforms to argue for a more inclusive peace that respects human rights, promotes justice, and ensures the safety and security of all citizens, particularly women and children. In conclusion, women in Afghanistan have shown immense resilience and leadership as peacebuilders and negotiators. Their involvement in peace processes not only contributes to ending the conflict, but also lays the foundation for a more inclusive, equitable, and peaceful society. While challenges remain, the growing recognition of women's role in peacebuilding offers hope for a future where Afghan women are not just survivors of conflict, but active agents of change in shaping the country's destiny. Participation in peace talks and civil society. In Afghanistan, the participation of women in peace talks and civil society has been crucial in shaping the trajectory of the country's post-conflict future. Historically excluded from formal peace negotiations and political processes, Afghan women have fought for a seat at the table, recognizing that lasting peace and stability cannot be achieved without their active involvement. Over the years, women's engagement in peace talks and civil society has gradually increased, and their contributions have been pivotal in advocating for inclusive, gender-sensitive peace agreements that address the needs of all citizens, particularly women and children. The inclusion of women in peace negotiations is not only a matter of gender equity, but also one of practical importance. Women bring unique insights and experiences to the peace process, often focusing on issues that may be overlooked in male-dominated discussions, such as the protection of civilians, the prevention of sexual violence, and the reintegration of displaced populations. The inclusion of women in peace talks can also help build trust between warring factions and encourage a broader, more sustainable approach to conflict resolution. One of the most notable instances of women's participation in peace talks occurred during the 2020 U.S. Taliban negotiations, where Afghan women's rights groups successfully advocated for the inclusion of gender equality provisions in the agreement. Despite the challenges posed by the conservative nature of Afghan society, these women's rights advocates worked tirelessly to ensure that any peace agreement would reflect their demands for women's safety, education, and employment opportunities. Though the final agreement did not fully address all their concerns, it represented a significant step forward in recognizing the importance of women's participation in peace negotiations. Beyond formal peace talks, Afghan women have played a vital role in civil society, organizing grassroots movements, advocating for policy change, and pushing for reforms that promote justice, human rights, and equality. Women's rights organizations, such as the Afghan Women's Network and other local groups, have been at the forefront of this movement, mobilizing communities, providing services to victims of violence, and advocating for legal reforms. These organizations have been instrumental in pushing for the inclusion of women in political processes and promoting awareness of women's rights, both within Afghanistan and on the international stage. However, women's participation in peace talks and civil society has not been without its challenges. Deep-rooted cultural norms, ongoing violence, and political resistance often impede their full involvement. Women face intimidation, threats, and even violence for their activism, and the patriarchal nature of Afghan society often sidelines their contributions. Nevertheless, Afghan women continue to fight for their voices to be heard, striving to ensure that the peace process is inclusive and that the future of Afghanistan is one where women's rights are respected and protected. In conclusion, the participation of women in peace talks and civil society is essential for building a durable and inclusive peace in Afghanistan. Their advocacy for gender equality and women's rights continues to shape the country's future, ensuring that the experiences, needs, and aspirations of Afghan women are not left behind in the peace process. Despite significant obstacles, women remain at the forefront of efforts to achieve a peaceful, just, and equitable Afghanistan. Grassroots organizing and local leadership. Grassroots organizing and local leadership have become central to the empowerment of Afghan women, particularly in the face of decades of conflict and social marginalization. Women in Afghanistan, despite the challenges they face from both the state and society, have been at the forefront of local movements that address critical issues such as education, healthcare, security, and gender-based violence. These grassroots efforts, led by women at the community level, have proven to be powerful catalysts for social change, enabling Afghan women to assert their agency and build support for a more inclusive society. One of the most notable aspects of grassroots organizing in Afghanistan is the role of local women's groups, which have been vital in advocating for women's rights and creating opportunities for women to engage in civic and political life. These organizations often operate in rural and conflict-affected areas where the state's presence is limited and access to resources is scarce. Women's grassroots organizations provide critical services, including legal aid, educational support, and healthcare, all while fostering a sense of solidarity and empowerment among women. They have also played a key role in raising awareness about gender-based violence, working to prevent it, and offering support to victims. Local leadership has proven essential in these efforts, as Afghan women often take the lead in organizing and mobilizing their communities. Many women who were initially excluded from public life have emerged as respected leaders in their communities, using their positions to advocate for education, economic opportunities, and better health care for women and children. Local leaders have become essential in negotiating peace at the community level, preventing the escalation of violence, and ensuring that women's voices are heard in conflict resolution processes. The rise of women in local leadership roles also challenges traditional gender norms in Afghan society, where women have historically been relegated to private domestic spheres. By stepping into public leadership positions, these women defy entrenched social expectations and demonstrate the value of women's leadership in all areas of life. In doing so, they inspire other women to become involved in their communities and in political processes, gradually transforming the societal perception of women's capabilities and roles. However, grassroots organizing and local leadership for women in Afghanistan is not without significant challenges. The constant threat of violence, social stigma, and limited access to resources often hinder the effectiveness and reach of these movements. Furthermore, many women leaders face resistance from local elites and conservative factions who view their activism as a threat to traditional power structures. Despite these obstacles, Afghan women continue to lead with resilience, finding innovative ways to overcome challenges and push for change. In conclusion, grassroots organizing and local leadership have been crucial to advancing the rights and opportunities of Afghan women. By organizing at the local level, Afghan women have fostered a sense of community solidarity and have led efforts to address the unique challenges they face. These movements not only empower women, but also pave the way for a more inclusive and equitable society in Afghanistan. The persistence and strength of local women leaders highlight the importance of grassroots efforts in the broader struggle for women's rights and social justice. Barriers to inclusion and representation. Despite the significant strides made by Afghan women in the political and social spheres, barriers to inclusion and representation persist, limiting their full participation in decision-making processes and public life. These barriers are multifaceted, stemming from cultural, political, and social obstacles that are deeply entrenched in Afghan society. Women face not only systemic discrimination, but also direct opposition from traditional norms that often restrict their access to education, employment, and political power. Cultural norms and traditional gender roles remain some of the most significant obstacles to women's inclusion in public life. In many parts of Afghanistan, conservative views about gender roles place women in the private domain, confining them to family and household responsibilities. These norms discourage women from pursuing education and professional careers, limiting their opportunities for leadership roles. In rural areas where traditional values are often more rigidly upheld, women's participation in public life is seen as a violation of long-standing social conventions. This deeply ingrained belief system presents a substantial barrier to women's inclusion in the workforce, politics, and civil society, as they are often discouraged from taking on roles that challenge these cultural expectations. Political instability and the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan have further exacerbated these challenges. Women seeking to participate in political processes or hold public office often face significant threats to their safety. The political climate in Afghanistan is marked by violence, insurgency, and instability, which disproportionately affects women who are involved in public life. Female politicians, activists, and journalists have been targeted for their activism, facing threats, intimidation, and even assassination. The lack of security and protection creates a hostile environment that discourages many women from participating in governance or advocating for their rights, further hindering their representation in decision-making processes. Additionally, the institutional barriers to women's inclusion in Afghanistan's political system cannot be overlooked. Although women have legal rights to participate in elections and hold public office, their representation remains disproportionately low, especially in higher positions of power. Political parties often exclude women from leadership roles, and women candidates are frequently marginalized in the electoral process. Furthermore, the male-dominated political culture and the patronage-based system make it difficult for women to access resources or gain political influence. These institutional obstacles contribute to the continued underrepresentation of women in both local and national politics. Finally, access to education and professional opportunities remains a significant barrier for many Afghan women. Although there have been improvements in educational opportunities since the fall of the Taliban, many girls and women still lack access to quality education, particularly in rural areas. Without education, women are less likely to enter the workforce or political sphere, making it difficult for them to challenge the status quo and assert their rights. In conclusion, the barriers to inclusion and representation for Afghan women are complex and deeply rooted in Afghan society. Cultural norms, political instability, institutional discrimination, and limited access to education all contribute to the marginalization of women. Overcoming these barriers requires comprehensive efforts that address the root causes of exclusion, including legal reforms, increased security, and a cultural shift towards gender equality. Despite these challenges, the persistence and resilience of Afghan women continue to drive progress towards greater inclusion and representation. Chapter 8: The Return of the Taliban 2021-present. The return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan in 2021 marked a dramatic and unsettling turning point for women's rights and gender equality in the country. After 2 decades of progress and reforms that allowed Afghan women to gain some freedoms, including education, employment, and participation in political life, the sudden collapse of the Afghan government and the swift return of the Taliban has left women facing a devastating rollback of their rights. The Taliban's resurgence has resulted in severe restrictions on women's freedoms, and a stark reversal of the gains made since the fall of their previous regime in 2001. Under the Taliban's current rule, women have been systematically excluded from public life and stripped of many fundamental rights. One of the most visible impacts has been the closure of secondary schools for girls, effectively denying them the opportunity for education beyond the primary level. Despite promises made by the Taliban to allow girls to return to school, the reality on the ground has been starkly different, with girls' education remaining severely restricted in most areas of the country. This regressive policy has not only hindered the educational advancement of Afghan girls, but also threatened the future of the entire country's progress. Furthermore, the Taliban's interpretation of Islamic law has led to strict limitations on women's participation in the workforce. Women have been banned from working in most sectors, especially in government positions, and are largely restricted to roles within the household. Women in urban areas, who had gained employment in various industries, now find themselves confined to the home, unable to pursue careers or contribute to the economy. This has compounded the economic hardship faced by many families, as the loss of women's income and labor has left households vulnerable. The Taliban's policies also extend to the broader social sphere, where women are subjected to increasingly severe restrictions on their personal freedoms. Women are required to wear the full body covering known as the burqa, and their movement is heavily restricted, with many women no longer allowed to leave their homes without a male guardian. Public spaces have become increasingly unsafe for women, with reports of harassment and violence being widespread. The Taliban has also cracked down on women's organizations and activists, forcing many to go underground or flee the country to avoid persecution. However, despite the oppressive environment, many Afghan women have continued to resist and fight for their rights. Underground networks and clandestine movements have emerged, with women finding ways to organize and advocate for their rights, even under the threat of violence. Women have also taken to the streets in sporadic protests, demanding their right to education, employment, and a life free from oppression. In conclusion, the return of the Taliban has led to a severe regression in the rights and freedoms of Afghan women, severely restricting their opportunities for education, employment, and public participation. While the situation is dire, the resilience of Afghan women and their continued efforts to push for change, despite immense obstacles, remain a testament to their courage and determination. Reversal of rights and restrictions on education. The return of the Taliban to power in 2021 has led to a sharp and devastating reversal of the rights and freedoms that Afghan women had gained over the past 2 decades. One of the most significant areas of regression has been the restriction on education. Under Taliban rule, girls and young women have been barred from attending secondary schools, marking a catastrophic setback in the fight for gender equality in education. This decision has not only denied thousands of young girls the opportunity to continue their studies, but has also undermined the future prospects of an entire generation of women. Prior to the Taliban's return, Afghan girls had made remarkable strides in education. In the years following the fall of the previous Taliban regime, the number of girls in school skyrocketed, with girls accounting for nearly 40% of all students by 2021. International organizations, NGOs, and the Afghan government had worked together to create schools and educational programs that encouraged girls' participation, even in rural and conflict-affected areas. For many, education represented a pathway to personal development, economic independence, and the opportunity to contribute to society. However, with the Taliban's resurgence, these educational advancements have been severely curtailed. Although the Taliban initially promised to allow girls to return to school, they quickly reneged on their commitment, and secondary schools for girls remain closed in most parts of the country. The decision to prohibit girls from attending school past the 6th grade has left them vulnerable to early marriage, domestic roles, and continued illiteracy. This regression not only harms individual girls, but also impedes the broader development of Afghan society, as an uneducated population is less likely to contribute to the nation's economic, political, or social progress. In addition to restrictions on formal education, women's access to higher education has also been dramatically reduced. Universities have been forced to implement policies that segregate classes by gender, with many departments either limiting or outright banning female students from attending. Female university students and teachers have faced restrictions on their academic pursuits, with reports of female faculty members being dismissed or forced into hiding to avoid Taliban retaliation. The closure of educational institutions for women represents a lost opportunity for women to gain critical skills, build careers, and become leaders in their communities. The broader impact of these educational restrictions is profound. Denying women access to education limits their ability to participate in the workforce and contribute to society's development. It perpetuates cycles of poverty, inequality, and dependency, making it more difficult for Afghan women to assert their rights and break free from oppressive structures. The denial of education is a violation of basic human rights, and for Afghan women, it represents the erasure of the progress they had fought for. In conclusion, the Taliban's restrictions on education are a stark reminder of the fragility of women's rights in conflict-affected regions. The reversal of rights and opportunities for Afghan women, particularly in education, threatens not only their individual futures, but also the future of Afghanistan as a whole. The closure of schools and universities for girls is one of the most devastating consequences of the Taliban's return to power, and marks a troubling chapter in Afghanistan's history. Underground resistance and digital activism. In the wake of the Taliban's return to power in 2021, Afghan women have faced an intense crackdown on their rights, particularly in the areas of education, employment, and public life. Despite the severe restrictions, women have not remained silent. Instead, many have resorted to underground resistance and digital activism to continue their fight for freedom and equality. These methods have allowed women to challenge the Taliban's oppressive rule, express their demands, and maintain a presence in the public sphere despite the risks involved. Underground resistance has become a crucial form of activism, particularly in urban areas where the Taliban's presence is strongest. Women's rights activists, educators, and leaders have formed clandestine networks to continue their work, often operating in secret to avoid detection. These underground groups focus on providing education to girls and women in private settings, organizing secret meetings, and disseminating information about women's rights and resistance strategies. In some cases, they have established underground schools, where girls continue to learn in defiance of the Taliban's ban on education for females beyond primary school. These efforts are not without danger, as women involved in underground activities risk severe punishment, including imprisonment, torture, or even death. However, their determination to uphold the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan drives them to persist, even in the face of immense risk. Alongside underground resistance, digital activism has become a powerful tool for Afghan women. Social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have enabled women to connect with each other, share their stories, and draw international attention to the repression they face. Afghan women have used digital platforms to organize protests, document human rights violations, and push for global support. Through the use of encrypted messaging apps and anonymous social media accounts, women have been able to mobilize without exposing their identities to the Taliban, who actively monitor online activity to suppress dissent. Digital activism has also played a key role in amplifying the voices of Afghan women on the international stage. International media outlets, human rights organizations, and foreign governments have increasingly relied on social media to report on the ongoing human rights abuses in Afghanistan. Afghan women have used these platforms to share their experiences, raising awareness of the Taliban's oppressive policies and drawing attention to the plight of women and girls in the country. The global community's recognition of these digital efforts has provided a sense of solidarity and support for Afghan women, even as they face isolation and repression at home. In conclusion, while the Taliban's rule has significantly restricted the rights and freedoms of Afghan women, underground resistance and digital activism have allowed them to continue fighting for their rights and advocating for change. These methods of activism have not only provided a platform for women to resist oppression, but have also showcased the resilience and courage of Afghan women in the face of extreme adversity. Through their actions, both covert and digital, Afghan women continue to challenge the Taliban's control and demand a future in which their rights are respected and protected. International responses and humanitarian impacts. The return of the Taliban to power in 2021 has prompted a wide range of international responses, particularly concerning the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan and the plight of Afghan women. The global community, including governments, international organizations, and human rights groups, has condemned the Taliban's actions, especially the rollback of women's rights and the imposition of strict gender apartheid. While diplomatic efforts and humanitarian aid have been directed toward alleviating some of the immediate suffering, the overall impact of these international responses has been mixed and complex. One of the most immediate responses to the Taliban's return was the suspension of foreign aid to Afghanistan, which had long been a major source of support for the country's government and infrastructure. The United States and European countries froze billions of dollars in aid, and international financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund suspended Afghanistan's access to loans. This sudden loss of financial support has deepened the country's economic crisis, leaving millions of Afghans struggling to meet basic needs such as food, healthcare, and shelter. The humanitarian crisis has been further exacerbated by the Taliban's refusal to allow significant international intervention, creating a barrier to the provision of aid on the ground. Humanitarian organizations, however, have continued to operate in Afghanistan, though their efforts have been complicated by the security situation and the Taliban's policies. Some organizations have managed to provide vital services such as healthcare, food distribution, and emergency relief, but the Taliban's restrictions on women's participation in the workforce have made it increasingly difficult to reach women and girls in need. Female aid workers, who are critical for reaching marginalized groups, have been banned from working in some areas, further limiting the effectiveness of aid efforts. Despite these challenges, the international community has continued to direct humanitarian aid toward Afghanistan, though it is clear that without meaningful engagement with the Taliban on issues such as women's rights, the situation is unlikely to improve. On the diplomatic front, the international community has struggled to find a unified approach to dealing with the Taliban regime. While some countries, particularly Pakistan and China, have sought to engage with the Taliban in hopes of stabilizing the region, others, including the United States and European nations, have imposed sanctions and refused to recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government. This has left Afghanistan in a state of diplomatic isolation, further complicating efforts to address the needs of its citizens, especially women and girls. In conclusion, international responses to the Taliban's return have been marked by a combination of condemnation, aid efforts, and diplomatic challenges. While humanitarian assistance has provided some relief, the Taliban's restrictions on women and girls, coupled with the country's economic collapse, have created a deeply precarious situation. The international community's ability to effectively address the crisis in Afghanistan will depend on a delicate balance of humanitarian support, diplomatic pressure, and a focus on the protection of human rights, especially those of women. Conclusion. The journey of Afghan women's rights has been marked by both progress and setbacks. While significant advancements were made post-2001, the return of the Taliban in 2021 has reversed many of these gains, especially in education, employment, and political participation. However, Afghan women have shown remarkable resilience through underground resistance and digital activism, challenging the oppression they face. Their courage continues to inspire global attention and solidarity. International responses to the Taliban's rule have been mixed, with humanitarian aid efforts continuing despite numerous challenges. Diplomatic efforts remain strained, as the world grapples with how to address the Taliban's disregard for human rights. The situation for women in Afghanistan remains precarious, but their persistence in advocating for their rights offers hope for a future where they can reclaim their freedoms. In conclusion, while the road ahead is uncertain, Afghan women's determination and resilience serve as a powerful reminder of their capacity to push for change, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The international community must continue to support their efforts and prioritize their rights in the broader conversation about Afghanistan's future.